The man known to history as Jefferson Phineas Davis was born near Fairview in the state of Kentucky on the 3rd of June, 1808. He was christened Jefferson in reference to the third President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, for whom his parents had great respect. His father was Samuel Emery Davis, whose family had come originally from Wales to the British colonies and had travelled to Georgia from Philadelphia. Samuel, born in 1755 or 1758, joined the American Revolutionaries and fought against the British Army during the War of American Independence. Joining several of his half-brothers, he spent most of his time with South Carolinian regiments and was wounded twice during the war. Samuel received a large land grant in Georgia for his service during the war and was appointed a clerk of the courts, a prestigious local position. Jefferson's mother was Jane Cook, who Samuel had met in South Carolina during the war. Little is known of her life, some stating she was the daughter of Baptist minister William Cook, while other accounts state she was the daughter of Irish immigrant Roger Cook. The couple were married shortly after the end of the war and settled in Georgia. She gave birth to her first son, Joseph Emery Davis, in 1784, and would have 10 children during her lifetime. The Davises remained in Georgia until 1797, when they moved to what is now Fairview, Kentucky. The year Jefferson Davis was born, his namesake, Thomas Jefferson, was ending his final year in office. His successor, James Madison, one of the leaders of the Jeffersonian Republican Party and one of the architects of the U.S. Constitution, had recently been elected. The United States was rapidly developing and expanding westward, particularly following the collapse of French efforts to renew their North American empire following the disastrous defeat against the Haitian forces in 1804. Napoleon Bonaparte had sold his North American lands to Thomas Jefferson in what has become known as the Louisiana Purchase, thus dramatically expanding the young republic's geographical holdings to the Rocky Mountains. The original 13 states had been joined by 4 others west of the Appalachian Mountains and Territories, with American governments forming across the western frontiers of the Republic. As had been the case since the American Revolution, the topic of slavery and its future in the Republic remained a hot-button issue. Slavery was well established in the U.S. by the time of Davis's birth and had been a feature of the American economy for almost 2 centuries. Repeatedly, Congress had debated the expansion of slavery into Western territories, with both Northern and Southern statesmen opposing the expansion of the peculiar institution. The abolition of slavery was already taking shape in the northern half of the United States, with many states adopting gradual emancipation laws and others, such as Massachusetts, legally ending slavery immediately. The United States also in 1808 abolished the African slave trade, and for many people in the United States it seemed that slavery was gradually headed towards extinction. However, while abolitionism was gaining ground, so too were pro-slavery arguments. The Haitian Revolution, which was the first large-scale slave revolt that had resulted in an independent black nation, had deeply troubled many people in the Atlantic world, in part because of the extreme violence that had been enacted by both sides during the Revolution. Pro-slavery writers looked to build upon people's fears of slave revolts and argued that not only was slavery an essential part of the Southern economy, but it also was necessary to preserve the safety of the nation. However, much to the chagrin of pro-slavery advocates, they struggled to gain dominance over abolitionism, setting the stage for decades of heated conflict. Jefferson Davis's family would have been well aware of these debates. Kentucky had a small but vocal group of abolitionists who had advocated abolishing slavery in the 1792 Kentucky Constitutional Convention. Furthermore, the Davises, like many Southerners, were looking towards the West for greater profits. Expansion to the West was connected deeply to Native American expulsion and the expansion of slavery. Samuel Davis and his family moved westward and established a plantation in southwestern Mississippi 2 years after Jefferson Davis was born, named Rosemont. While slavery was certainly a hot topic in the early republic, other issues, such as how to organize the republic's electoral politics, how to run the economy, and how to interact with foreign powers, were all filling the national discourse. Many foreign visitors were shocked by how rapid the growth of the young republic was. While many Europeans looked down on Americans for their roughness and lack of refinement, others marveled at the growing strength of the republic. While many Americans worried that the republic was under threat from European superpowers, a sense of confidence and optimism was increasingly felt by many Americans that their nation could rise to be a self-sufficient and powerful state. Jefferson certainly took in all this optimism and flurry of ideas that demanded the United States focus on becoming a power in the Americas. Jefferson was the youngest child in his family and received the doting attention of his parents and siblings. His elder brother was a lawyer and owned his own plantation and rising in Southern society. Jefferson's father was keen that his youngest son be taught the ways of the Southern gentleman, which he saw as being founded on honor, courtesy, and hospitality. These views were held concurrently with a complex racial ideology which held black people to be an inferior species over whom white planters had a right of ownership. In order to further the sophistication of his son, Samuel sent Jefferson to St. Thomas Aquinas College in Kentucky, which disquieted Jane, who was concerned about her son being sent to study so far away, and who was worried that the Baptist doctrines held by the family would clash with those of the Catholic school to which he was being sent. It was on his way to the school with his father in 1816 that the 8-year-old Jefferson Davis was introduced to Andrew Jackson, the general who had defeated the British at the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812 and who was considered by many to be the true successor of Thomas Jefferson when they traveled through Nashville, Tennessee. The visit left a great impression on Davis. Davis studied in Kentucky for 2 years, after which he returned home and studied in local schools for a further 5, during which time he gained a reputation as a mischief maker and a decent student, albeit one without much inclination towards study. During this period, a considerable and fierce debate raged over the status of lands west of the Mississippi River and the expansion of slavery, particularly during Congress in 1819 and 1820. The push of the Northern abolitionist congressmen to halt the spread of slavery infuriated many Southerners, and rumors began to circulate of a civil war. Averting this disaster, a political compromise known as the Missouri Compromise proposed that in order for a new slave state to join the Union, a free state thus had to be admitted, thus preserving the congressional balance of power between slave and free states. Furthermore, it defined the 36th parallel as the boundary between slave states and free states, with slave states only being permitted south of the line. Though an uneasy compromise had been achieved, many across the nation were frustrated at the outcome of the compromise. Northern abolition societies grew, as did the vocal defenders of slavery. Though it appeared a pro-slavery consensus had been achieved, the reality was that neither side had given ground ideologically, a fact that would shape the conflicts of the next several decades. In 1823, at age 15, Davis returned to Kentucky to study at Transylvania University, which was then one of the most highly regarded schools in the South. During his time at university, Davis came to realize that he had a talent for debating and became engaged in the school's political and social life, meeting with the sons of influential Southern families. However, after his first year at university, Jefferson was greeted with the unwelcome news that his father had been bankrupted and forced to sell Rosemont. Shortly after he had received this information, he was informed that his father had contracted malaria and died. With Samuel gone, Jefferson's older brother Joseph assumed the role of the head of the Davis family and bought back Rosemont, a fact which brought Jefferson joy. However, he was soon informed that his family had arranged for him to attend the United States Military Academy at West Point, which perturbed him. Jefferson had intended to follow his brother into law, and professed that he had little interest in the military. The South had a strong connection to West Point, and Southerners outnumbered their northern counterparts in the school where Davis matriculated alongside other promising cadets, such as Robert E. Lee. However, unlike some of his classmates, Davis did not fit well with the West Point model. He was often reprimanded for his sloppy dress and lack of punctuality, and was punished for several offences, including firing his rifle out of a bedroom window, spitting, and intoxication, and he was threatened at least twice with expulsion. Somehow, Davis managed to remain in the academy, and he eventually gravitated towards military science, and accepted the prospect that he would serve as a junior army officer for a few years after he graduated. Davis left West Point in June 1828 and returned home to Mississippi before transferring to Missouri, now a slave state and the hub of military and economic expansion towards the West, to serve as a second lieutenant. Davis cut a dashing figure to the young women of St. Louis and was very popular, yet he was soon transferred again, this time to Fort Winnebago on the Wisconsin River in what was then Michigan territory. Davis was constantly sick and considered the region dull. Davis spent his time overseeing the management of an army base and the construction of a sawmill, and in the winter of 1830 to 1831, Davis caught pneumonia and was nursed back to health by his enslaved servant, Jim Pemberton. After this interlude, Davis was posted to Galena, Illinois, where he mediated a conflict which had developed between settlers and Native Americans. Davis cared little for the indigenous population and generally regarded them as inferior and savage, as was typical of many Westerners. Davis generally favored settler communities whenever he had the chance. Davis remained in the region until 1832, before he asked for leave to return home. Whilst he was in Mississippi, tensions between Native American and settler communities in Illinois had reached a breaking point and erupted into what became known as the Black Hawk War, named for the chief who led the native resistance. Davis missed the fighting, but returned to Illinois in time to be posted as a commander in Black Hawk's guard duty when he was transferred from Fort Crawford to St. Louis. By 1833, Davis remained at the lowly rank of second lieutenant despite having served as an officer for 5 years. This lack of recognition and excitement led Davis to frustrated insubordination. He was eventually promoted to first lieutenant of cavalry, but his attitude remained the same, and he was later court-martialed for being disrespectful to his commanding officer, Major R.B. Mason. Jefferson put his debating skills to work, as he was able to successfully defend himself by arguing that Mason had disrespected his honor first. It was during this period that Davis caught the eye of Sarah Knox Taylor, the daughter of Colonel Zachary Taylor, his commander at Fort Winnebago and later President of the United States. The two exchanged love letters for 3 years before Davis proposed to her in 1835, which was reluctantly agreed to by his commander, who had only a few years earlier denied Davis's request. Jefferson resigned his commission and married Taylor at a ceremony in Kentucky. Davis had, by this time, begun building up his status by purchasing enslaved African Americans and obtaining 800 acres from his brother Joseph, where he founded his own plantation called Briarfield Plantation. However, tragedy struck when only a few days after going to Louisiana for their honeymoon, the young couple became sick with malaria. Davis recovered. However, his young bride continued to struggle until her death on September the 15th, 1835. Davis was devastated at the loss of his wife and returned to his brother's plantation to recover. He threw himself into building his plantation, expanding the cotton production of his land with the labor of his enslaved servants. During this time, Davis took a short trip to Cuba and then spent time in Washington, D.C., where he attended sessions of Congress, which was in full swing. Davis listened to the lively debate surrounding how involved the United States should become in the revolt of American settlers in the Mexican province of Texas. In April 1836, Texan rebels had routed the Mexican army at the Battle of San Jacinto, and there was a debate as to whether the territory should be admitted to the United States. Southerners overwhelmingly supported the move, but many in the North were concerned about admitting such a large slave state to the Union. He likely listened to men such as John Calhoun from South Carolina, who had increasingly threatened to lead his home state out of the Union, a policy which enraged the then President Andrew Jackson, who rejected the idea of secession. Davis had no personal quarrel with the idea of slavery and maintained a belief that militias were required in order to keep slaves in order and to prevent rebellion. However, whilst a defender of slavery and the ideology of white supremacy, Davis disagreed with some fellow landowners in their approach to treating slaves as animals who could be subject to pure physical coercion. He allowed his slaves to use his guns to go hunting and to help themselves to his corn supply, and provided decent health care in the event of injury or illness. While expanding his own cotton plantation, Davis watched the development of national politics with keen interest, and soon found an outlet for his general boredom by entering the political arena. The two dominant parties of the era, the Whigs and the Democrats, both had broad national appeal. The Whigs were generally favored by the Southern elite, although Davis ended up backing the Democrats, the party of Andrew Jackson and Thomas Jefferson. The Democrats were generally favored by smaller plantation owners, although they were the underdog party in Davis's district. Davis found that he was a natural politician and was soon put up by the Democrats in large debates for state offices. This was the era of stump speeches and rowdy party meetings. Supporters and opponents flocked to public speeches as candidates took American democracy directly to the voters. Davis excelled in this environment as a public speaker, and in 1843 he made a run for the Mississippi legislature, narrowly losing out to a Whig contender, but captured the attention of state Democrats with his spirited campaign. As a result, he was chosen in 1844 to be one of the state's presidential electors for James Polk, for whom Davis rallied during his presidential campaign, even though he had initially supported John Calhoun and made a name for himself in conducting a lecture circuit in which he attacked the Whigs with barbed remarks. It was during this time that he made his own political views clear, stating his support for the annexation of Texas, the end of tariffs which harmed the Southern economy, as well as the annexation of Oregon Territory, placing his support firmly with those who backed Manifest Destiny and the expansion of the United States. In 1844, Davis became engaged to Varina Howell, a native of Natchez, Mississippi. Davis had removed himself from much of the romantic scene since the death of his wife, but he had fallen in love with Howell, who had an extensive knowledge of politics and literature. The two were married a year later in 1845 and honeymooned in New Orleans, and in late 1845, Polk was elected president, and Davis, as his spokesman in the South, gained considerable political influence as a result. With this high level of political backing, Davis decided to run for Congress and was duly elected to the House of Representatives. He arrived in Washington 3 weeks after he learned of his victory and set about garnering support for the annexation of the Oregon Territory, which he believed to be of vital importance for the health and safety of the United States. Davis also advocated for policies which backed a Jeffersonian interpretation of the Constitution, such as the clear division of power and shared responsibilities between federal and state governments. Davis's time in Congress was cut short when, in March 1846, tensions between the U.S. and Mexican governments reached a breaking point. When U.S. troops occupied the Rio Grande, which was claimed by Mexico, and on the 11th of May 1846, Polk convinced Congress to pass a declaration of war against Mexico on the basis of a small border infringement. Davis once again joined the army so that he could fight for the United States. He resigned his seat in Congress and assumed command of the 1st Mississippi Rifles Infantry with the rank of colonel. Davis outfitted and armed his soldiers at his own expense, and sailed for Texas to fight under the command of Zachary Taylor, his former father-in-law. Taylor, known as Old Rough and Ready, was a gifted general, and Davis found him a fair and effective commanding officer. In September, Davis's regiment was sent to besiege the town of Monterey, and after an assault which lasted a week, the fortified town fell. However, this victory led to several negative events. Taylor, a popular general, was seen as a political threat to Polk, who, in an effort to hamstring Taylor's military capabilities, directed troops away from his command and toward General Winfield Scott, supposedly as a precursor to an assault on Mexico City. Santa Anna, a Mexican general, learned of Taylor's weakness and attacked his forces in February 1847, a battle during which Davis was shot in the foot. This engagement in the mountain pass of Buena Vista was to become one of Davis's finest moments, despite his injury. During the battle, he pushed his men forward and halted the Mexican advance, turning the tide in favor of the Americans, and, by the end of the 22nd of February 1847, Taylor had defeated the Mexican assault. Davis was hailed as the hero of Buena Vista, and he was sent home soon after as a result of his injury. Once home, Davis observed the events unfolding in Mexico from afar, unable to militarily affect the outcome of the war. Davis wished for the expansion of the U.S. into the entire area of Mexico, and his wish was granted in part when the Mexican government capitulated in early 1848, handing the U.S. California and its other northern territories. This acquisition occurred alongside the signing of a treaty with Britain, which handed the U.S. control of Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. Collectively, these events expanded the land area of the U.S. by more than a half. The expansion pleased expansionists such as Davis, but inflamed the debate over slavery, which was now questioned in relation to these new states. In December 1847, Davis returned to Congress, this time on crutches, where he was hailed as a national hero and took up the vacant seat for Mississippi in the Senate. The intensity of the debate around slavery heightened rapidly after this period, characterized with the introduction of the Wilmot Proviso, sponsored by David Wilmot, which attempted to prevent any expansion of slavery to the new, formerly Mexican territories. Davis, along with many other Southerners, viewed this as a definitive attempt by Northern politicians to control the South, which increased the war footing that Southern politicians adopted. The question of California was also incendiary, and it was feared that if the territory, recently populated owing to the gold rush, would enter into the Union as a free state, that this would give the advantage to free states in Congress. The tempo of these debates soon reached fever pitch, and fistfights began to break out between representatives in Congress, whilst Southern politicians increasingly mentioned and then threatened secession from the United States. Davis adopted a position which sought to keep the South in the U.S., but to sustain its slave economy, he argued that the South should have a fair share of slave states in the new territories of the West. While supporting the South remaining in the United States, Davis also broke from his political hero Andrew Jackson in declaring that the South had the right to secede from the Union. This explosive view rested on the belief that the federal government had overstepped its bestowed authority by attempting to enforce anti-slavery policies both in the South and in the wider congressional settlement. In short, Davis argued that the North had no right to use the federal government to tell Southerners what to do with their property, which, in his view, included the people they kept as slaves. Many Northerners who espoused the concept of free labor, a political belief system that held that free labor, or people working for pay, was far superior to enslaved labor. Built upon ideas that have been advocated since before the American Revolution by men such as Benjamin Franklin, free labor ideology insisted that slavery was unproductive and also immoral. It harmed white people and degraded men into a state of savagery. However, free labor aided nations and people in becoming virtuous and increased economic output. Equally committed to American expansion, free labor advocates believed that it was essential that lands be kept out of the hands of slaveholders and instead given to individual citizens to work as small farms. Expansion west was a safety valve to the increasing population and wretched living conditions in the North's inner cities. More and more Northerners were becoming convinced that not only was slavery degrading, but it was an active threat to the progress of free labor, particularly as Davis and his fellow Southerners advocated for the expansion of slavery. Davis was at the center of two competing visions of American empire, one being based in free labor and the other on slavery. Davis, a vocal and feisty advocate for slavery, was consistent in his push to turn America towards an increasingly pro-slavery policy. The deepening divide between the two camps concerned many Americans, including Davis's former father-in-law, Zachary Taylor. Zachary Taylor had, by 1849, become president and was deeply concerned by talk of secession. Other politicians, such as Henry Clay, attempted to bring about a settlement with the Compromise of 1850, which suggested that California be admitted as a free state, with other new states admitted on the basis of their own decision. Resolutions passed at the same time that a call for the abolition of slavery in Washington, D.C., where it was still legal, was presented. The compromise was deeply unpopular across the country. It divided the two sides between their moderate and extreme wings. Moderates on both sides hailed the proposal as a way of avoiding conflict and division, whereas hardliners argued either that the proposal was too restrictive on slavery or not restrictive enough. Davis, joining other irate Southerners such as John C. Calhoun, himself argued that the bill did not protect the rights of the South adequately and felt that the compromise did not define and guarantee the rights of slave states on the question of admitting new Western states. Politicians such as Henry Clay and Stephen A. Douglas, the key organizers of the compromise, defended the concept. While many Southerners were, in fact, in favor of a compromise, there was still enough political capital to continue to support hardliners such as Jefferson Davis in pushing back against the compromise. In the autumn of 1851, Davis was informed that the Democratic candidate for governor of Mississippi, John Quitman, had resigned from the race. Davis was invited to take up the mantle and returned to Mississippi to fight for the seat. He narrowly lost the race and returned to his plantation, adamant that he would remain out of politics until the people of Mississippi came to back his point of view. In 1852, Davis and Varina had their first child, whom they named Samuel. The pair would go on to have 5 other children, 3 boys and 2 girls. However, only his female children lived beyond the age of 21. As his family grew, Davis found himself returning to the world of politics as he engaged in campaigning for Franklin Pierce, who was successfully elected president, leading Davis to be offered a position in the cabinet as the Secretary of War as a reward for his loyalty and efforts. Davis took his position in 1853. The happiness that Davis felt at this newfound political success was undone by the death of his son, Samuel, in 1854. Davis remained inconsolable for many months after his son's death, yet despite this tragedy he remained a highly competent leader, and the War Department was well managed. He helped lead the War Department through a series of new innovations, including the formation of the Army Medical Corps, new cavalry and fortress-building tactics, as well as shipping camels over from North Africa to act as pack animals in the new southwestern territories. Davis also extended his reach into other areas of governmental administration and oversaw the construction of a new dome and wings to the Capitol building, and even attempted to plan and map out a new transcontinental railroad, one that ran through the South, of course, and perhaps one of his most ambitious failed ventures was an attempt to get the Spanish government to sell the island of Cuba to the U.S., which he hoped would be entered into the Union as a slave state. Davis was vigorous in his vision of building the American Republic, following closely in Thomas Jefferson's vision of an American empire of liberty, that is, an empire that prioritized the liberty of those of European descent. Rather than just be an empire confined to the North American continent, Davis and others viewed the American empire expanding southward, incorporating the Caribbean, Central, and South America. With these expansions, slavery would progress as well. In 1854, Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas proposed that the populations of Kansas and Nebraska decide for themselves whether they would be slave or free states through the medium of a popular vote. Almost immediately, large groups of free labor and pro-slavery advocates crossed the border lines into Kansas and Nebraska territory. Hostilities quickly escalated into violence and vigilantism, with large groups of Missourians also crossing the border to inflame the tensions in what was soon to be known as Bleeding Kansas. The conflict shattered the Whig Party and gave birth to a new party, the Republican Party. The free labor anti-slavery movement played a crucial role in the formation of the Republican Party, which became the most popular anti-slavery party. Republicanism's popularity further surged with the events of Bleeding Kansas, the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, and the integration of many smaller northern parties. The Republicans soon became a strong opponent of the Democrats, who maintained the support of the South and advocated in favor of slavery or, at a minimum, a continuation of the status quo. Davis watched these developments with concern, particularly the rise of a popular anti-slavery party. He had ended a speech in 1848 warning against the unholy prospect of a civil war, and it seemed ever closer. Davis was re-elected to the Senate, which was done through the state's legislature in 1856 after the Democratic nomination went to James Buchanan. Davis resumed his seat as a senator and began a grand tour of the state to better learn the will of his constituents, particularly if they would back a war against the North. Davis was certain and publicly maintained that it was the North antagonizing the South, and that slavery was an institution upon which the region depended. While Davis and other Southern leaders continued to push for an expansion of slavery, the national harmony frayed even further following the Dred Scott decision in the Supreme Court. The case revolved around an enslaved man named Dred Scott, who had sued for his freedom after being held in bondage in a free northern state. The judicial ruling, which sided with the defense, argued in the majority opinion of Chief Justice Roger Taney that black men had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, thereby declaring, in other words, that Congress had no right to impose limits on slavery and that it could spread beyond the boundaries imposed by state and federal legislatures. Even more inflammatory than the Missouri Compromise, the nation seemed near the point of disillusion. Pro-slavery advocates celebrated the ruling, while northern populaces became more firmly entrenched in free labor ideology and anti-slavery beliefs. Furthermore, Northerners saw this as a direct attack upon their way of life, as it perhaps opened the introduction of slavery into states that had legally barred the institution. Both sides threatened violence in the aftermath of the ruling. Davis returned to the Senate ready to attack his fellow Senate colleagues from the North, but found that they had rallied after the outcome of the case and proclaimed in even stronger terms the evil of slavery and their desire to abolish it. For Davis, the North had lost their minds. President Buchanan tried his best to keep the nation together, but struggled under the weight of the two factions which had become ever more divided since the ruling on Dred Scott's case. This division affected Congress, who began to heatedly and sometimes violently debate the matter at hand. In one instance, a congressman from South Carolina beat Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner with a heavy cane so badly that he was incapacitated for the following 3 years. While some have argued that slavery was in decline and vastly unpopular in the Atlantic world, or the regions touching the Atlantic Ocean, in fact, slavery had begun to have a resurgence in popularity, in part spurred by the tremendous economic success of the South, as well as pro-slavery propaganda which relied on racialized arguments to justify the enslavement of people of color. Slavery was never stronger. Even in anti-slavery hotbeds like Great Britain, certain cities, such as Liverpool, had rallied around the South's cause. Davis and his contemporaries sensed this change and pushed hard to seize the advantage in this to-the-death struggle with free labor ideology. As Northerners hardened their stances against the South, Davis and his fellow hardliners urged a boycott of the North and its products, thus shifting capital back to the South. The strain of the conflict took a toll on Davis, and he began to suffer severe health problems. By the winter of 1857, he had lost sight in one eye and was emaciated, his doctor demanding that he step back from politics in order to recover. Davis did so in 1857, travelling with his family, hypocritically, to a resort in the North. Davis returned to Congress in late 1858 and focused his energies on drawing up plans for the expansion of the South into Cuba and engaging in ferocious conflict with Northern Democrats such as Stephen Douglas. In October 1859, events came to a head when the abolitionist John Brown attacked a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry in Virginia in an attempt to incite a slave insurrection, after which he was tried and executed for treason. Many Southern politicians were outraged at Brown's raid and saw it as a demonstration of the willingness of abolitionists to engage in violence in order to promote their views, forgetting that they, too, had engaged in violence to expand slavery. Davis, ensconced in Washington, struggled to assess the views of his voters in the South. Did they back an escalation of force with the North? Davis pondered this question, but drifted ever closer to the Southern radicals in Congress, and in April 1860, the Southern Democrats met in Charleston, South Carolina, in order to elect a new presidential candidate. Davis knew that he had widespread support in the South, but understood that he was a controversial figure and unlikely to win much support in the North as a result. He therefore made no effort to seek the nomination. The Democratic Convention was left divided between two candidates. Northern politicians broadly supported Stephen Douglas, and Southern Democrats backed John C. Breckinridge. A few weeks later, Abraham Lincoln secured the nomination for the Republican presidential candidate on the promise that he would end the spread of slavery, though not to abolish it. The election that followed was a disaster for the Democrats. Seriously divided between two polarizing candidates, Abraham Lincoln was able to defeat their challenge with ease by providing a stable reassurance that he would end the spread of slavery, a sentiment which rallied and united much of the North. Lincoln made clear from the outset of his presidency that he had no ambition to abolish slavery, rather to stem its spread. This was a statement designed in part to appease the South, which remained suspicious and continued to debate secession from the Union. Lincoln won the presidency without a single Southern electoral vote, the first time in the nation's history. Many Southerners believed this signaled the end of the South's dominance of the presidency. South Carolina, on the 20th of December 1860, declared formally that it was leaving the United States, closely followed by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Virginia and the northern southern states hesitated, desperate for some sort of compromise to emerge. When he learned that Mississippi had seceded from the Union, Davis left Congress and gave a farewell address on the 21st of January 1861. He called for all southern states to cede and argued that they had been driven to this course of action as a result of the aggression and intransigence of the North. On the 8th of February 1861, the ceded states issued a declaration which proclaimed a constitution for a new Confederate States of America, making clear that the new nation was founded on supporting slavery and individual rights for each state. Davis was selected to be the president of the new Confederacy, based on his extensive experience and popular support in the South. On the 18th, Davis delivered his inaugural address on the steps of the Capitol building in Montgomery, Alabama. He spoke of the new Confederacy in revolutionary terms and compared the Declaration as akin to those who had revolted against the British in 1776. Davis believed that the South was following in the tradition of the American Founding Fathers and saw their actions as a return to the correct principles of the past. After he had concluded, Davis went to work in forming and organizing a new cabinet, filling the 6 available positions with one man from every Confederate state bar Mississippi, his own. Davis also understood the importance of international recognition for the Confederacy and sent commissioners to Europe in order to try and establish formal relations as a matter of urgency. It appeared that Great Britain and France would be willing to align with the Confederates. However, hesitancy on the great powers' part aided the Confederacy, and demonstrations in Liverpool were held in support for the South. Davis also armed the Confederacy and oversaw the formation of the Navy and state militia, which would form the basis of the Confederate armed forces, and directed a great deal of attention in trying to convince the slave states which had remained a part of the Union to come over to the Confederate side so that their economic, military, and political power be augmented. Lincoln attempted the opposite and extended a hand of friendship to slave states, assuring them that the South would not be invaded and that they would be permitted to peacefully coexist with free states in the North. He also warned that the Union would not tolerate seizure or damage to any of its property, a term which was soon to be violated in a move which sparked off the Civil War. Davis and his fellow politicians in Confederacy were irritated and threatened by the presence of a Federal outpost, Fort Sumter, which lay on an island at the entrance to the port of Charleston, one of the South's most important landing areas. Davis was informed in April 1861 that a Federal naval convoy was headed to the fort and ordered that it be reduced, a command which was received by General Pierre Beauregard, who subsequently bombarded the fort from the shoreline. This attack sent shockwaves throughout the continent, and Lincoln declared that it was an act of rebellion against the U.S. government, subsequently ordering 75,000 volunteers to fight against the insurrection. Tennessee, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Virginia all ceded from the Union at this stage and joined the Confederacy, with 4 other states, Delaware, Missouri, Maryland, and Kentucky, remaining in the Union but unofficially contributing many thousands of men to the Southern war effort. In June 1861, the Confederate capital was moved to Richmond, Virginia, to which Davis traveled in the same month, hailed by cheering crowds and salutes. From Virginia, and alongside figures such as Robert E. Lee, Davis began to sketch out the war plan for the South. Both he and Lee preferred to fight a defensive war and hoped to take advantage of new weaponry which gave an advantage to troops ensconced in a defensive position. The two men also hoped to deploy the Confederacy's navy and squadrons of privateer vessels against Northern ships, wearing it down and eventually leading it to sue for peace. The summer of 1861 saw the first battle of the Civil War, after Lincoln had ordered General Irvin McDowell to march on Richmond with his main force. Beauregard was defending the southern capital with a large force assembled at Manassas Junction. Both armies were confident that the war would be a quick one and end in their rivals' defeat. Sightseers from Washington, D.C. came to watch the battle, confident that the North would handily whip Johnny Reb. When the two forces engaged on the 21st of July, a defense was successfully mounted by Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson, who rallied the Confederate troops and won the day, sending the Northern Army reeling back towards Washington. The success animated the South, and led to a belief that the war could be won quickly. Davis lamented that he had not ordered his troops to pursue the attackers back to Washington to launch his own counterattack. Davis soon had to contend with his generals, some of whom were angered that they had not received a promotion, as well as the problems associated with the northern naval blockade of the South, which he hoped to offset with the use of ironclad gunboats which would smash the northern force. In June 1862, Lee was given command of the Confederacy's largest force, the Army of North Virginia. Davis remained especially close to Lee, and the two men had an effective and personable partnership. 1861 progressed without further engagement, and the rest of the year was spent planning a spring assault on the North. Meanwhile, the Union planned to attack the South by wearing it down through a combination of naval blockade, the capture of Richmond, which lay close to Washington, and the destruction of Southern arms factories. The spring of 1862 brought mixed fortunes for the South. They had successfully deployed ironclad gunships against the North and had used the CSS Virginia to sink 2 U.S. vessels. However, the Union had defended the remainder of its blockade force and forced the South to cede control of the important ports of Norfolk, Pensacola, and Jacksonville. General George McClellan, the new Union commander, had launched another massive assault on Virginia from the north, which prompted Davis to expand his own army through the passage of the first ever American conscription law, a move which allowed Stonewall Jackson, Lee, and Joseph Johnston to defend the capital and once again push their attackers away. While the South revelled in the success of its armies in the East, it had, however, lost several of their positions in the West to General Ulysses Grant, including Forts Henry and Donelson, which opened the way for Northern forces to attack Nashville. A furious battle was fought at Shiloh in April 1862, where the South nearly defeated Northern forces before they rallied and forced the Confederacy to back down. This action led to the death of General Johnston, a loss which deeply affected and upset Davis. Facing losses in the West and a stalemate in the East, the Confederacy continued to suffer from economic mismanagement at this time, and high levels of inflation rendered its banks impotent. Davis responded to shortages by printing money, which made the situation worse, and conscription had gutted out the domestic workforce as well as those who were employed to oversee slaves. In the summer of 1862, Lee proposed that his army march north and invade Maryland, with an attempt to capture both Baltimore and Washington, a plan to which Davis agreed, believing that such a move could convince Maryland to cede from the Union, but the plan was thwarted when Lee's troops were engaged by McClellan's Army of the Potomac at the Battle of Antietam on the 17th of September and driven back, in what was one of the bloodiest battles of the war. The Union victory at Antietam led Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that, as of the 1st of January 1863, the North would consider any enslaved person in the Confederacy to be a free person. This action angered the South beyond measure, but won the North a great deal of international support and further isolated the Confederacy. Furthermore, the Union Army began recruiting all African American units, which further inflamed Southern anger. Jefferson Davis responded by calling for laws to punish captured black soldiers which resulted in brutal measures that violated the laws of war. In early 1863, the Confederacy defeated another Union attack at Fredericksburg, Virginia. Any beliefs that a swift victory could be enacted against the Union, though many were hopeful as the Southern armies under Robert E. Lee continued to inflict defeats on the Union. Though the situation had worsened in the West, Davis and others believed that one successful knockout victory in the North would bring in outside support from France and Great Britain. Furthermore, Confederate leadership knew that the war had become increasingly unpopular in the North, with many Copperhead Democrats winning positions, thus threatening the war effort. The romanticization of war had run into the hard reality of conflict. Families and communities were decimated as thousands of men never returned from the dozens of battlefields throughout the South and Southwest. The Union naval blockade had been very effective, but other aspects of the Northern military had failed to realize significant gains. Still, Davis felt immense pressure from both the outside and internal affairs. In the early half of 1863, Davis had travelled to the front and delivered speeches to soldiers and civilians, many of whom were sombre and depressed. He himself had been affected by the war, as the Union Army had captured his Mississippi plantation. Davis returned to Richmond feeling wholly encircled. Texas, Arkansas, and Mississippi were directly threatened by Generals Sherman and Burnside of the Union Army, and he knew that the South would lose if the conflict became a war of attrition. Indeed, the President of the Confederacy had also come under fire from his own population, with critics arguing that he was a nepotistic leader who gave positions of command away on the basis of his friendships and not the abilities of the person, that he neglected the Western Front, and that he governed without sufficient consultation with his cabinet. The war effort in general had declined in the South, with high rates of desertion and the evasion of front-line service from able-bodied men, wealthy families avoiding service by claiming a right to defend their property, and the hoarding of food and wares by many. The farmers and smallholders who formed the basis of the Confederate Army generally did not own any slaves at all, and found themselves fighting for a cause from which they themselves did not benefit, whilst those with slaves avoided service. The Southern economy was also in tatters, with the Northern blockade suffocating many Confederate industries and conscription preventing many farms from being harvested. Bread riots soon erupted in Southern towns, and dissatisfaction with the war and the Confederacy spread. Furthermore, British imports of Egyptian cotton had staved off an industrial collapse in England, thus hurting the South for their strategy to hold off shipping cotton to Europe in order to blackmail European nations to side with them. In May 1863, Lee won a victory over General Hooker and his Army of the Potomac at Chancellorsville, although the same battle led to the death of the revered General Stonewall Jackson, who was shot by his own troops, undermined the morale boost of this victory. At Vicksburg, Mississippi, the last Confederate position on the Mississippi River, General Grant had laid siege to the city, thus threatening the South's use of the Mississippi. Lee and Davis decided to take aggressive action and attempted to attack Washington itself. Lee attacked Pennsylvania in June 1863 and was soon near Harrisburg, the state capital. On the 1st of July, the Confederate Army came into contact with Union cavalry forces at the town of Gettysburg under the command of General George Meade, commander of the Army of the Potomac. The initial skirmish between the two sides soon became a large battle which lasted for 3 days. Lee's attacks on Union positions were repelled with great losses. General George Pickett launched a final suicidal attack on Union positions on the morning of the 3rd of July, which failed, and forced Lee to withdraw, leaving many thousands of bodies behind him. Meanwhile, at Vicksburg, on the 4th of July, the Confederate Army surrendered, thus severing the Confederacy in two. Davis referred to the loss at Gettysburg as the darkest hour of our political existence, and settled on the belief that the only way the South could win was if some anti-war faction in the North toppled Lincoln's government before the South was forced to concede. Davis attempted to secure the South's financial position by selling vast sums of cotton, which he had shipped to neutral ports in the West Indies on runner ships that transported cotton out of the South and brought back much-needed supplies. General Buxton Bragg in Tennessee had some limited success against the North when he defeated the Union Army at the Battle of Chickamauga, although he was criticized for not pressing a counterattack and was asked to resign by his general staff, a conflict into which Davis had personally to intervene in order to keep order. Bragg was later defeated at the Battle of Chattanooga in Tennessee, after which he was forced to withdraw his troops, opening the way for the Union into Atlanta. Despite the desperate situation in the South, Davis refused to surrender. He ate and slept very little, and his health declined even further as the war dragged on. In April 1864, his son Joseph was killed after he had fallen from a balcony, and he entered a mood of deep depression. The effect this had on his governance can be seen in the orders he issued around this time. Davis had requested to Lincoln that prisoners be exchanged, to which the Union president disagreed. Davis responded to this by mistreating Union prisoners, packing them into barbarous prisons, such as that at Andersonville, a move which only served to further embolden the Northern war effort. In March 1864, Grant was made Supreme Commander of the Union armies, a rank which had not been held by any other person since Washington himself, and in May he launched a massive attack on Virginia, whilst Sherman attacked Johnston's forces in Georgia. On both fronts, the Confederate Army was outnumbered by 2-1, and the South was forced into a punishing defensive action. Johnston was soon pushed back towards Atlanta, and a frustrated Davis replaced him with General John Bell Hood, whom he saw as more aggressive. By autumn of 1864, the Confederacy had been split in three, with Sherman adopting a policy of total war as he set the southern countryside ablaze with his so-called March to the Sea. Davis remained convinced that the South could prevail and did not want to concede without a fight. He attempted to rally his ministers and his population for a final stand, even proposing that slaves be forced into the Confederate Army to fight on behalf of the system that enslaved them. However, this order was never carried out. Secret negotiations with the North intensified when Vice President Alexander Stephens met with Lincoln in order to negotiate a truce, though Lincoln declined the offer. On April the 2nd, 1865, Davis and his staff collected their papers and travelled out of Richmond, their remaining troops destroying anything in the city which could be of value to the enemy. He ordered that the Confederate citizens continue the fight, though, to his shock, Davis learned that Lee had chosen to surrender at Appomattox in northern Virginia on the 9th of April, rather than begin a guerrilla war in the mountains of Virginia. With the situation desperate, Davis headed south to North Carolina and Georgia, attempting to raise armies to strike back at the Union. His generals and Confederate governors all stated that they did not have the troops to do so. Moving westward, Davis believed that he could fight from the west, where a Confederate army under Kirby Smith was still active. As he traveled southward, he learned on the 15th of April that Lincoln had been shot and later killed. While heading west on May the 5th at Washington, George Davis officially dissolved the Confederate government. Only a few days later, as he was crossing Georgia, he ran straight into trouble. On the 10th of May, Davis was captured by Union cavalry officers outside of Irwinville, Georgia, whilst wearing a loose-sleeved cloak and having his head covered with a shawl, leading to the legend that he had been captured dressed in his wife's clothing as a disguise. The Confederacy had been well and truly defeated. Its economy, population, political system, and infrastructure lay in ruins, and hundreds of thousands of its men lay dead on battlefields across the North and South. Furthermore, now the Union not only stopped the expansion of slavery, but it also rejected it entirely, immediately freeing all those people who remained in slavery at the end of the war. The war fought to prevent the North from stopping the spread of slavery had ended with a complete abolition. It was a world turned upside down, and Southern whites were in a state of shock. Davis, once a respected and revered statesman, was now a laughingstock, hated and despised. He was imprisoned by the federal government. He had become the scapegoat for the defeat of the Confederacy, and it was only through the efforts of his wife Varina that he was eventually released on a $100,000 bail. President Andrew Johnson later pardoned Davis of the charges of treason leveled against him and all former officers of the Confederacy. However, even as a free man, Davis felt disconnected from the states he had once governed and was disquieted to see Union soldiers in the state capitals that he had once thought of as a separate country. In 1868, Davis moved his family to London, England, in the hopes of becoming an agent for a cotton importing firm, and was pleased for a short time at the warm welcome he received from members of the British aristocracy and Southern families who had moved there. He soon returned to the U.S. and took up a job as the president of the Carolina Life Insurance Company in Memphis. While there, racist politics had once again become influential in the South, spearheaded by organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan, which briefly served to revive Davis's status in Southern politics. However, he lost it all when, in 1874, the insurance firm Davis headed crashed, leaving him with little financial reserves. After several years of failed business ventures in the South and Europe, Davis moved to the Gulf Coast of Mississippi in 1877 after he was invited by a friend, Sarah Dorsey, to live with her, a move which put some strain on his marriage. In 1878, his son died, soon followed by Dorsey herself, who left Davis her house and much of her estate. Here he worked on his book, The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government, which was criticized for being dry and polemical, and quickly fell into obscurity. His reputation after the war did not much improve, although Robert E. Lee defended his friend, stating that he was a talented leader and statesman and that he had kept the Confederacy on its feet during the darkest days of the Civil War. In the final months of his life, Davis was visited by many former Confederate soldiers and citizens who wanted to thank their once leader and who respected him for following the so-called lost cause. In 1886, he took advantage of this revival of popularity and travelled with his daughter on a final tour of the South, where he was loudly cheered and heralded as a hero. In 1889, he developed a bronchial infection and died in New Orleans on the 6th of December 1889, and was interred first in that city, finally to be moved to Richmond, Virginia. Jefferson Davis is seen both as a hero and a traitor, a man who attempted to found a nation and a man who is a symbol of white supremacy and rebellion against his government he swore an oath to protect. His life was intertwined with the rise of the American Republic as a continental power, and he was key in pushing for an American empire of liberty that would encompass all of North America. However, his liberty revolved around a republic that permitted and encouraged the expansion of racialized slavery both to the West and to the South. Davis was an ardent defender of slavery and of the South's right to maintain it, even at the cost of his own health. His leadership of the Confederacy has marked him as a villain of history, though some remember him as a defender of states' rights. Davis was a talented speaker, a keen motivator, and an effective communicator, yet he was willing to fight for slavery to the bitter end, even at the cost of thousands more lives. What do you think of Jefferson Davis? Was he a defender of the legacy of the Founding Fathers, or was he a traitor to his country and an advocate of the evil institution of slavery? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
The man known to history as Robert Edward Lee was born on the 19th of January 1807 in Stratford Hall, Virginia. His father was Henry Lee III, who was born into a privileged family and was also a famous American Revolutionary War hero. Henry Lee grew up in one of the foremost families in Virginia, as his mother, Lucy Grimes, was once courted by George Washington, while his father, Henry Lee II, bred horses. When Henry III turned 14, he attended Princeton, with other founding fathers like Aaron Burr and James Madison standing out amongst his peers. It was during this time that Henry Lee became wrapped up in revolutionary sentiment and joined the Continental Army. He climbed through the ranks and earned the nickname Light Horse Harry, following the cavalry charge he led at the Battle of Paulus Hook, New Jersey, which drew the attention of George Washington. Following the war, he served as the governor of Virginia. Robert E. Lee's mother was Anne Hill Carter, who was born into a prestigious and wealthy plantation family. Anne's father, Charles Carter, was a fifth-generation plantation owner of the Shirley Plantation. Anne Carter married Henry Lee III during his governorship on the 18th of June 1793 in the governor's mansion parlor room. Following his retirement from the governorship, Anne moved in with Henry Lee at the family's holdings. Together, the couple had a total of 6 children, but only 5 survived into adulthood, with Robert E. Lee being the 5th child born. When Robert E. Lee was only 1, the family fell on hard times, as the main source of income, the Stratford plantation, was taken via entail and given to Henry's son from his first marriage, Henry Lee IV. The lost revenue was just one financial disaster that fell upon the family, as Henry Lee had terrible luck in land speculation and ended up in debtor's jail twice. While protecting one of his friends who opposed the War of 1812, Henry Lee was injured severely and left the family to recover. Robert E. Lee would not see his father again, as he died on the 25th of March 1818 on Cumberland Island, Georgia, whilst trying to reunite with his family. Ultimately, Robert's father became known simply as the man who wrote Washington a bad check. Lee spent his time with his widowed mother in a modest home, though this was only possible due to the Carters leaving a small legacy to sustain her. The family lived at the Ravensworth plantation, which was owned by one of Anne's relatives, William Henry Fitzhugh. Ravensworth plantation would serve as the backdrop for Lee's depressing childhood, as the house was on the outskirts of Alexandria, in the swampy, mosquito-infested and unhealthy part of town. The house's interior was never painted while the Lees resided there, and they did not live alone, as they frequently shared with boarders. Lee did not live a privileged childhood, but he had fond memories of his pet lobster and hummingbird, which began his love of animals. Yet they sadly both passed on the same day. Lee spent his summers swimming in the Potomac and playing in the local springs. He attended a plantation school in Fauquier County before attending the Alexandria Academy at the age of 14. He received an excellent education whilst attending the Alexandria Academy, learning literature, algebra, as well as the classics. Lee's family was well connected to the Virginia aristocracy. This led to Fitzhugh penning a letter to United States Secretary of War John C. Calhoun, imploring that he allow Lee a spot at the United States Military Academy, West Point. Fitzhugh had Lee deliver the letter personally to Calhoun, which resulted in Lee being enrolled at West Point in 1825. For all of Lee's life, he had lived in the world of slavery, and now that he would be attending West Point, he would be entering a world where slavery was all but extinct. But despite the Lees' financial situation, they maintained 4 slaves left to Anne by her father. Lee was accustomed to being surrounded by slaves, but as he went further north, the number of enslaved blacks lessened, and whilst they were still not equal, many held freedoms Lee was not accustomed to. West Point at the time focused heavily on engineering, thanks to its superintendent, Brevet Major Sylvanus Thayer. Before Thayer had arrived at West Point, it was marred with drunkenness, disorder, and riots, but he transformed the academy into a prestigious institution. He introduced the famed cadet uniform, with grey coats, starched white trousers, and plumed black leather hats, with polished brass scales for the chin straps. When Lee arrived in June of 1825, there were roughly 200 cadets who would be given an exam intended to weed out those who were idiots and misfits. Following that, the cadets who made it through the examination were paired with 3 other cadets who shared a tent. Together, the tent mates had to purchase a joint toilet, a looking glass, a washstand and a basin, pitcher, tin pail, broom, and a scrubbing brush. The quality of the food was often described as poor, yet Lee never complained about it. Wealthier cadets who snuck out of West Point would visit Gridley's Tavern to eat, drink, and smoke. Most who went out would be given a demerit, but Lee never received any demerits, accomplishing a feat few others achieved. The curriculum consisted heavily of mathematics and French, as mathematics was crucial for military officers of the era, whilst France was the only ally to the United States and most military textbooks were in French. The Marquis de Lafayette often visited West Point to inspect the cadets, and these visits inspired Lee as Lafayette and his father Henry had fought together in the American Revolution, bringing 18th century heroes into evolving 19th century military tactics. Lee's daily regime at West Point started at 5:30 a.m. with the Reveille. Following a full day of mathematics and French classes, along with hours of independent studies, the cadets finished their day with full dress drills, parade, and inspections. The cadets' day would officially end at 10 p.m., and whilst all cadets maintained a busy schedule, Lee made many friends during his time at West Point. One such friend was troublemaking third-year cadet Jefferson Davis, who was caught going off grounds to the local tavern to get drunk. He was only allowed to remain due to his previous good standing. When Lee's first year at West Point finished, he was third in his class and achieved a rating of 285 and a quarter out of 300 total points available. He was placed on a list with the other distinguished cadets, and Lee's status among the good and the great was odd for a man new to the academy. His reputation would earn him the nickname Marble Man for his emotionless expressions, whether he won or lost. During Lee's second year, drawing was included in the curriculum, as officers were expected to be able to draw a usable map. Lee was made a senior cadet and tutored many of his fellow cadets in mathematics. He was enamored by the campaigns of Napoleon Bonaparte and read multiple books about his campaigns. Many of these books were new to the United States, showing the impressive collection West Point had. Also, Lee's ability to read French with relative ease allowed him access to these texts, as they would not have been translated into English. Many of Napoleon's tactics would be used by Lee on the battlefield, as, like Napoleon, he refused to fight on the defensive and preferred to use rapid attacks and bold flanking maneuvers. Following Lee's second year, he maintained second place standing in his class and applied for leave to visit his mother, who now lived with Lee's oldest brother, Charles Carter Lee, in Georgetown. His mother's health had greatly deteriorated since Lee went away to West Point, and when he came home, he took control of her care. Lee returned in 1827 for his third year at West Point and added physics and chemistry to his course list. Lee was introduced to battalion tactics and artillery use on the battlefield. He enhanced his knowledge by reading Machiavelli, Hamilton, Rousseau, and John Paul Jones. His wide command of different subjects outside of the military or engineering made him a special officer, though he remained in second place in his class. When Lee started his final year, he was given the position of Adjutant of the Corps, which is the highest position a cadet can hold. He would take his final exam on the 1st of June, 1828, finishing second once again, only to Charles Mason. Upon graduating, Lee was given his choice of commission as a lieutenant in the Engineer Corps, a prize worthy of a top student at West Point. Though his achievements while at West Point would bring joy to Lee for a time, another family hardship would hit him hard. Lee had just arrived home when it became clear his mother would not recover, and in a couple of weeks of his return home, Anne passed away. Following his mother's death, Lee spent much of his time in Arlington, Virginia, especially with Mary Anna Randolph Curtis. The two met during Lee's first furlough, and he made a good first impression whilst attending house parties in his grey cadet attire. Ironically, they were seen as a mismatched pairing, as Lee was never late and was overly organized, while Mary was almost always late and scatterbrained. Despite this, the two took their time with supervised visits and hoped eventually for a future together with the blessing of Mary's parents. On the 11th of August 1829, Lee received orders from Washington to report to Major Samuel Babcock of the Corps of Engineers in Cockspur Island, Georgia. Unfortunately for Lee, Cockspur Island was a depressing, hostile location with heat, humidity, fever, and mosquitoes, which made summer work unbearable. But it was also near where his father was buried. The Corps of Engineers had been attempting to build a fort to protect the mouth of the Savannah River, but was struggling to succeed. Lee immediately got to work, even getting involved in the labor himself, although most of his work would be destroyed by a storm after the labor season ended. Major Babcock would not return to Cockspur, as he was replaced with Lieutenant J.K.F. Mansfield. Mansfield lacked confidence to complete the project, and in turn would be replaced with Captain Delafield. Lee and Delafield immediately began outlining new plans for the fort, with Lee acting as the draftsman. Savannah would teach Lee a valuable lesson with regards to the sedated decision-making of the Corps of Engineers, and how projects lacked sufficient funds and were located in the worst places possible. He felt that if a situation was hopeless to change, you should remove yourself from the situation, and so Lee used his connections in Washington to get him reassigned to Old Point, Virginia, at Fort Monroe. Transferring to Fort Monroe would bring him closer to Mary, and his smart decision-making would set him apart from others. On his way to Fort Monroe, Lee stopped in Arlington to see Mary, and whilst there, he finally convinced her father to let them marry. Mary took Lee to the dining room to eat, and Lee asked Mary if she would marry him. The couple would marry on the 30th of June 1831, and Mary decided to share Lee's quarters at Fort Monroe. She did so, and they lived there completely on their own, without any support from her father. The two were quite unique, as Mary had a tendency to boss Lee around the house, something unusual in the era. Nonetheless, the two maintained a strong bond, and it was during this time that the Lees acquired a place in Arlington, a location which enabled him to put down roots, something he never had during his childhood. The Arlington House, as it would be later called, was heavily inspired by Lee's relative's house, Mount Vernon, or George Washington's plantation. The couple moved into Lee's quarters at Fort Monroe in August of 1831, but his ability to work would be affected by problems with the authority of the garrison, between the fort and school leader Brevet Colonel Eustis and the engineer leader Captain Andrew Talcott. Disputes rose frequently between the two men, mainly because the labourers for the engineering corps were disruptive to military procedures, which vexed Brevet Colonel Eustis. Despite the conflict between the army and the engineers, Lee excelled and took on vast amounts of responsibility, despite his inferior rank to many other officers. Lee worked hard to complete Fort Monroe, which would become known as the Gibraltar of Chesapeake Bay, and it was during this time at Fort Monroe that America's only effective slave revolt occurred in Southampton County, Virginia, which became known as the Nat Turner Rebellion. Nat Turner was an educated slave who preached to other slaves about the evils of slavery and how one day God would release them from their chains, allowing them to enact their revenge against their owners. An eclipse gave Turner the sign he was looking for, and he started his rebellion on the 21st of August 1831. As a result of the rebellion, Fort Monroe received 3 companies of artillery to deter any further rebellions. This event would shock the South, as the myth of happy slaves was ultimately laid to rest. It also resulted in stricter laws regarding the freedom of slaves. Robert E. Lee was always consistent regarding his view on slavery and its effects on society. He was never an enthusiastic supporter, and in a letter to Mary, he stated that, quote, "Slavery as an institution is a moral and political evil in any country. It is useless to expatiate on its disadvantages. I think it, however, a greater evil to the white man than to the black race, and while my feelings are strongly enlisted on behalf of the latter, my sympathies are more strong for the former." Although Lee expressed his approval of the institution of slavery, he still held the common view in the latter half of his letter that, quote, "The blacks are immeasurably better off here than in Africa, morally, socially, and physically. The painful discipline they are undergoing is necessary for their instruction as a race, and I hope will prepare and lead them to better things. How long their subjugation may be necessary is known and ordered by a wise and merciful providence. Lee held a young moderate Southern gentleman's view on slavery. While he agreed that slavery was immoral, he believed that the problem of slavery would be handled by God in his time, and it was not the responsibility of politicians or slave owners to answer the question. While Lee's approach was more of inaction towards the institution, despite his objection to it, others would take a different approach. Henry Clay, John Randolph, and Richard Bland founded the American Colonization Society to sponsor the creation of Liberia to send free blacks back to Africa. In order to satisfy slave owners, they were to be compensated for the loss of their slaves. Ultimately, the Liberia plan failed in its initial goal, and as tensions rose, it was written off as a slaveholder's scheme. The politics at Fort Monroe continued, and despite Lee's low rank, he always seemed to have more influence than senior officers, such as Colonel Eustis. This is believed to be because General Gratiot, the chief of the Corps of Engineers, had more political sway in Washington, D.C. over the chief of artillery. Lee would lead the project to extend and reinforce a 15-acre artificial island, which would eventually become Fort Wool. This new fort would be used to support and defend Fort Monroe with crossfire at enemy vessels. Though the work was steady, he gained no joy from it and began to doubt his choice to join the military. The new soldiers who arrived at Fort Monroe brought new social life, primarily in the form of drinking, although Lee would abstain for the most part, and never understood the obsession with getting drunk. Unlike many of his fellow young officers, he was never seen as being stuffy and was considered to be great company to be around. He kept his distance from his peers and was a reserved man. Mary would visit Lee at Fort Monroe in June of 1832, and it would be during this time that the couple would announce the impending arrival of their first child. The Lee's first child would be George Washington Custis Lee, who was named after his grandfather, George Washington's adopted son. Mary would spend much of her time raising him at Arlington. Between 1832 and 1834, Lee would essentially take charge of the engineers at Fort Monroe from his friend and superior, Captain Talcott, who was frequently absent. Yet his time would be short at Fort Monroe, as in 1834, Lee would be transferred to Washington, D.C., to the War Department. Lee found the office work at the War Department to be monotonous, with the chances of being promoted relatively slim, while the pay was even worse. But he would enjoy the birth of his first daughter, Mary Custis Lee, in 1835. During this time, General Gratiot hardly visited the project sites, leaving Lee in charge of overseeing their progress. He was bound by endless red tape and would only be saved from the paperwork when he was dispatched to assist his old friend Captain Talcott in the Midwest Territories in 1835. In the state of Ohio and the territory of Michigan, fighting broke out over a small section of land known as the Toledo Strip. The Toledo Strip spanned 500 square miles and included the important port of Toledo. This conflict would eventually result in the Toledo War, which was little more than a brief skirmish, as the only injury was a Michigan deputy who was stabbed by a boy with a penknife. During the dispute, Captain Talcott and Lieutenant Lee surveyed the area to better determine the boundaries of Ohio and Michigan, and ultimately Michigan lost the Toledo Strip to Ohio, but in return it received the Upper Peninsula, which would be the cause of the rivalry between Ohio and Michigan. Following his surveying of the Ohio and Michigan border, Lee was dispatched in 1837 to St. Louis to solve a major problem. The Mississippi River was cutting a new channel that threatened the port that brought trade to St. Louis, and Lee was the only suitable candidate to tackle the assignment. The port of St. Louis was an important transportation site, as many Americans who traveled west to California and Oregon would meet there, and should Lee fail, westward expansion might come to a complete halt. Lee had two objectives: save the port and waterfront and remove as many trees as possible from a 200-mile stretch of the Mississippi River along the Missouri-Iowa border. The technology of navigational engineering was still in its infancy during Lee's time in St. Louis, and Lee needed to find a way to curb the river's natural will to change direction. The Corps of Engineers had dumped tons of boxed sand around Bloody Island in order to push the current towards St. Louis and away from the new channel. But the boxes were smashed, which only worsened the situation by increasing the bar. After the wooden boxes failed, they tried using teams of oxen to dredge up the sand, yet that attempt too would ultimately fail. The river was not impossible to tame, as Lee had learned many lessons and knew that he must create barriers that were strong enough to channel the current that would also create resistance to destroy the dikes. Lee reflected back to his days at West Point, specifically a French textbook on hydrodynamics, and used that as his inspiration for the project. The original idea was to use the undergrowth to snag debris that floated down the Mississippi River. The Lees had their third child on the 31st of May 1837, this time a boy, William Fitzhugh Lee. Despite being overjoyed at the newest addition to the family, the pay Lee was receiving in the army was slowly lessening his ability to take care of his family properly. But Lee's work in St. Louis did not go unnoticed, and in July of 1838 he was promoted to the rank of captain. In the summer of 1839, on the 18th of June, the Lees welcomed their fourth child, Anne Carter Lee, to the family. However, his work in St. Louis would be stopped by angry Illinois citizens who opened fire on his workers with cannons, out of fear that the progress Lee was making would cut them out of the increasingly lucrative trading along the Mississippi River. The Illinois citizens had hoped to prevent the growth of St. Louis in order to force trade through their city, and an injunction was issued by the Second Illinois Circuit halting all work on Bloody Island. Lee had worked hard to improve the conditions along the Mississippi, but by the summer of 1840 he returned to St. Louis to finalize the affairs of the army by selling the equipment it had purchased for the work. Lee was then reassigned to New York City to oversee the reconstruction of Forts Hamilton and Lafayette, along with the battery positions on Staten Island. The restoration of these fortifications was vitally important, as the only major threat to American authority was Great Britain, as they were the only nation who had the means to bring the fight to American shores. Yet, before his arrival in New York, the Lees had their fifth child, Eleanor Agnes Lee, on the 27th of February 1841. His duties in New York were deemed significant enough to encourage his family to move with him, yet Mary and his children would not join him right away. Mary's unwillingness to move to New York at first was criticized by many, as she would have been expected to go wherever Lee went. Yet in her defense, she had 5 children between 1832 and 1841, and suffered from arthritis and general poor health. Mary would join Lee in New York in the spring of 1843, but would leave shortly after when she found out she was pregnant with their 6th child, Robert E. Lee Jr., on the 27th of October 1843. But Lee was still in New York, focusing on the forts. Although Lee was a skilled engineer, he had very few other accomplishments which would bring him the attention he deserved. However, he did have one highlight on his resume. Lee was named as a member of the Board of Examiners at West Point in 1844. He would spend 2 weeks at West Point overseeing and judging the final exams of the cadets, along with Major General Winfield Scott, the commanding officer of the U.S. Army, who formed a positive opinion of Lee during the time they spent together. Scott was a large, towering figure of the day, also a hero from the War of 1812, with the nickname Old Fuss and Feathers. Lee was never the type of person to use flattery to advance himself, like many other officers. although this would never have worked on General Winfield Scott, as he was known to soak up flattery like a sponge. So Lee used his intelligence instead to impress him. The impression Lee made on General Winfield Scott gave him some advantages, as from 1844 to 1846 he acted as a congressional liaison for the Chief of Engineering while simultaneously working in New York. He was also appointed to be a member of the Board of Engineers for the Atlantic Coast Defense, and during this time, in early 1846, Mary gave birth to the Lee's final child, Mildred Child, who was affectionately called Millie by Lee. The action which Lee was seeking would eventually happen when events out west began to heat up. Mexico and the United States were trying to establish hegemony over the West as the territory was increasing in population density. The origin of the disputes go back to 1810, when Moses Austin was granted land in Texas by the Mexican government. The Mexican government hoped the American settlers would provide a buffer between the raids of the Comanche tribe and the Mexican citizens. Instead, the Americans overwhelmed the Mexican government, who did not have the administrative or military ability to keep them in line. The ineffectiveness of the Mexican government to corral the American citizens would result in the overthrow of the government by General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, who was nicknamed the Napoleon of the West. He would both threaten to take military action on the American settlers and offer to sell them more land. General Santa Anna made good on his threats and attacked the Texan-held mission called the Alamo. From the 23rd of February to the 5th of March in 1836, the 100-men garrison held off the 1,500-strong Mexican army, but the Alamo fell on the 6th of March. The women and children of the mission were allowed to leave, but the men were slaughtered at the site, leading to the famous battle cry, "Remember the Alamo," which stirred the American public into a frenzy. Following the massacre at the Alamo, the Texans routed the Mexicans at the Battle of San Jacinto, which forced Mexico to recognize Texan independence. 10 years later, Texas would be annexed by the United States in 1845. Mexico was outraged at the annexation of Texas, while the northern states were irate at the addition of another slave state into the Union. Mexico broke off its diplomatic relations, yet President James Polk wished to maintain diplomatic relations in order to purchase California and New Mexico. Mexico continued to experience political instability, as the Mexican presidency changed 4 times, the Ministry of War 6 times, and the Finance Ministry 16 times. Despite this instability, if there was anything that could unite the Mexican people, it was their hatred for losing Texas to the Americans. The border between the United States and Mexico was disputed, as Mexico believed the border was along the Nueces River, while the United States believed the border lay along the Rio Grande. As a result, President Polk sent Brigadier General Zachary Taylor to occupy the land, but they were attacked by a Mexican cavalry unit, killing 16 Americans. The Thornton Affair, as it became known, gave the American government the cause to attack Mexico, as Polk argued to Congress that American blood has been shed upon American soil. In response, General Taylor moved swiftly against the Mexican army, defeating them twice at Palo Alto and then at Resaca de la Palma. The Americans outclassed the Mexican army with its advanced weapons, which included the speedily deployed horse artillery and the Colt revolver. The outbreak of the Mexican War gave Lee the opportunity he was looking for to better his rank in the military, and on the 19th of August 1846 he would be dispatched to San Antonio de Bexar, Texas, to report to Brigadier General John E. Wool. General Wool and Captain Lee were stopped along the Rio Grande when a Mexican officer appeared with a flag of truce, reporting that General Taylor had defeated a Mexican army at the Battle of Monterrey. Apparently, General Taylor had accepted an 8-week armistice in return for its surrender. This armistice, as Lee and others speculated, only served as a barrier to allow Santa Anna to recruit and train new soldiers to fight against the Americans. And on the night of the 18th of November, news reached camp that the armistice had been cancelled by President Polk to the relief of Lee and the other soldiers. Lee and the army advanced deep into enemy territory towards Parras to support General Worth in Saltillo and arrived 2 days before Christmas. Lee led a scouting mission to determine the position of the Mexican army and was quite determined in his pursuit. His tenacity impressed General Wool, who made Lee his acting inspector general. Lee would learn that being persistent whilst carrying out reconnaissance paid off, and also to not take exaggerated reports seriously. General Wool was ordered to join up with General Taylor in Buena Vista to support him against Santa Anna, where Santa Anna was routed by a force of 5,000 Americans against his 14,000 Mexican force. Lee left to join General Scott on the 17th of January 1847, and upon his arrival was accepted into Scott's general staff and inner circle. Lee was quartered on the flagship USS Massachusetts, sharing his room with former West Point classmate Joseph E. Johnston. In total, 12,000 men would be under General Scott's command for the invasion of Veracruz. On the 19th of February 1848, the fleet sailed to the Lobos Islands to rendezvous with the rest of their forces, but were delayed due to smallpox outbreaks and a vicious storm. The fleet left on the 3rd of March and arrived in Veracruz on the 5th of March, where Lee first saw the imposing island fortress of San Juan de Ulua, which guarded the city. Lee boarded the Patrita along with General Scott to survey the beaches, but the ship strayed too close to the fort, leading to an opening salvo from the fortress. This was the first time in Lee's 22-year-long military career that he had been under fire. On the 9th of March, 2,595 soldiers went ashore with no resistance from the Mexican army, and during the night of the 22nd of March, the American mortars opened fire. By the 27th of March, Veracruz had fallen to the Americans. Lee's first taste of battle would leave him disheartened, as he would write to Mary that, "It was awful. My heart bled for the inhabitants. The soldiers I did not care so much for, but it was terrible to think of the women and children." Lee never had a love for glory for his own sake, and his first battle left him melancholy. General Scott then looked to Mexico City, which was 280 miles away, but his supply lines would be stretched thin. The United States Army had no intelligence concerning where Santa Anna's army was located, let alone their size. Santa Anna had returned to Mexico City following his defeat at Buena Vista and raised a new force of 12,000. General Scott left Veracruz with 6,000 troops and found Santa Anna at Cerro Gordo, where he held an imposing defensive position. Following a reconnaissance mission, Lee informed General Scott there was a potential pathway they could cut to the extreme left flank of Santa Anna's line without them knowing. Scott agreed and gave Lee the opportunity to guide a division to the Mexican army and commence the battle on the 18th of April. In preparation for the assault, the soldiers started scaling the hill on the 17th of April, but they made too much noise and alerted the Mexican army, who started advancing down the hill. They countercharged up the hill, pushing the Mexican army back before finally establishing a hold on the summit of La Atalaya. Ultimately, the Mexicans were defeated at the Battle of Cerro Gordo, and the Americans only suffered minor casualties in comparison to the Mexican army. Lee's actions at the Battle of Cerro Gordo earned him a promotion to brevet major and praise from all of his superiors. Lee would leave with Scott, along with Lieutenants P.G.T. Beauregard and George B. McClellan, towards Mexico City. Following a small engagement at Molina del Rey, the army was now in position to assault Chapultepec, an important fortress. As it overlooked Mexico City, which would allow for continuous assaults. As a senior engineer, Lee argued against a direct assault on the fortress, but Lee was overruled and led Pillow's division to the west flank of Chapultepec. The first assault was pushed back, but the second assault was successful, with Lee climbing the slope accompanied by Lieutenants James Longstreet and George Pickett. Lee was injured during the assault, but was able to help General Pillow away from the battle. Following the fall of Chapultepec, nearly all Mexican resistance collapsed, but Mexico City wouldn't be fully pacified until 2 days later due to Santa Anna releasing armed criminals from the local prison. It was a solemn peace, as many Americans believed they had bullied Mexico throughout the war. Lee would be promoted to brevet colonel for his actions at Chapultepec and eventually returned home on the 29th of June 1848. It took roughly 32 years from the time he started as a cadet at West Point for Lee to rise to brevet colonel, and in comparison to other officers of the time, he advanced only slightly faster than the average officer. While Lee would not receive a proper promotion, he was elevated to serve as the superintendent of West Point in 1852, a major accomplishment and a compliment to his teaching abilities. Although Lee was not thrilled at the prospect, as he unusually complained to his friend P.G.T. Beauregard that there was an impossibility of either giving or receiving satisfaction from overseeing West Point. Nonetheless, he worked hard at bettering the cavalry school by lobbying for new stables and a practice ring. It is also possible that Lee designed the new facilities himself, as they were very similar to the stables at Lee's home in Arlington. Under Lee's guidance, West Point produced the finest cavalry officers of the era. He cared about the well-being of the cadets, but he could not coddle them, or else they would prove to be poor officers. West Point cadets were notorious for their high jinks along with their rowdiness and undisciplined behavior. As a result, Lee would turn towards corporal punishment, demerits, and the worst of cases, the expulsion of the cadet from the academy to maintain discipline. Those who did not possess the skills needed to become an officer were allowed to resign. Despite Lee's doubling down on disciplinary measures, the problems plaguing West Point were still not fixed during his 2.5-year tenure. Lee received his first true promotion in March of 1855, when Secretary of War Jefferson Davis offered Lee a lieutenant colonel post in the 2nd Cavalry. This promotion would come at the cost of Lee's position in the Corps of Engineers, and also meant he had to leave his family behind. Whilst Lee had longed for the opportunity to leave the Corps of Engineers, his time in Texas would be unpleasant. A series of personal tragedies befell him, as both his mother-in-law and his sister Mildred died. A little over a year later, his father-in-law George Custis died in October of 1857. He was the only father figure in his life, and now he was gone. Not only did he lose family members, but he lost his favorite mare, who ran off with a wild horse. After his father-in-law's death, Lee returned to Arlington to settle the affairs of Custis' estate, which were in disarray due to years of neglect. Custis left his 196 slaves to their own devices towards the end of his life, only expecting them to cultivate their own personal gardens to grow their food. The change in ownership brought uncertainty, as they had no control over their destiny. Lee would invest a large sum of money into the estates to upgrade the living quarters for the slaves, partially quote, to do what is right and best for the people, but also because he needed their labor to make a profit to settle the debts Custis had left. As a result, Lee unintentionally caused disquiet amongst the slaves when he began hiring out slaves to other plantations without communicating how long they would be gone. The slave community at Arlington had been together since their time at Mount Vernon, as they had been allowed to stay together, unlike other slaves whose families had been broken up. Custis Will did free his slaves, as he was a member of the American Colonization Society, However, Lee made use of a provision which allowed him to retain them until the debt had been paid. As a result, the slaves began to test Lee's resolve to keep them on the plantation, sometimes in open rebellion. They asserted they were legally as free as Lee was, yet they had almost no legal grounds to declare their freedom. Some of those who attempted to test Lee were Wesley Norris, his sister Mary, and their cousin George Parks, who ran away from the plantation in late spring of 1859. They were eventually captured and brought back to Arlington. Accounts of their punishment spread in excruciating detail in the abolitionist papers, which would sometimes greatly exaggerate the accounts to generate attention. This does not mean the punishments such as whipping, which Norris received, were not true, as Lee and other witnesses do corroborate the general accounts of the event, but they disagree with the exact details. Norris claimed that Lee personally whipped him and the other slaves as punishment, yet a man of Lee's standing in Southern society would never have doled out punishment himself. It would have been a blotch on Lee's social standing if he personally dealt the punishment, which may have been the reason behind the accusation. On the 17th of October 1859, J.E.B. Stewart, otherwise known as Jeb Stuart, rode to Arlington requesting Lee attend the War Department immediately. Lee immediately left with Stuart, entering into a meeting with President James Buchanan, along with several cabinet members. John Brown, an abolitionist, and 18 other men had just taken a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, killing a few civilians and taking hostages. Lee and Stuart were both sent via a special train to take control of the situation from the local militia, who corralled Brown's forces in the engine house of the arsenal. When Brown refused to surrender, the Marines sent with Lee stormed the engine house, leaving 1 Marine and 2 of Brown's freedom fighters dead. Lee would dismiss Brown's attempted revolution as the attempt of a fanatic or a madman that could only end in failure. Lee, along with many other future major players such as Thomas Jackson, Edmund Ruffin, and John Wilkes Booth, would watch Brown's execution. Unknown to Lee, Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, had lit the fuse for the events of the next 5 years. Following the events in Harper's Ferry, Lee was asked to return to Texas in February of 1860. Many Southerners were relieved of their posts due to the increased talks of secession by Southern state representatives. Lee was appalled at the idea of deconstructing the country and saw it as anarchy. Yet Lee, like many others, would choose to side with whatever path their state would take. Americans had a sense of responsibility to family and state over the nation as a whole, which played a significant role in the coming conflict. He swore to never take arms against the United States, but if Virginia left the Union, he would give his life to defend her. Ultimately, the choice would be left to a statewide convention, but its decision would not be made soon. On the 13th of March, 1861, Lee attended a reception for military officers at the White House, where he met with Abraham Lincoln for the first and only time. President Lincoln knew of Lee's uncertain allegiance and hoped to maintain Lee within the Union. He offered him the position of colonel in the 1st Regiment of Cavalry, a position Lee could not afford to turn down. Yet peace would become unattainable in early April when Lincoln decided to resupply Fort Sumter, which was being blockaded by rebel forces under the direction of P.G.T. Beauregard. General Beauregard gave the order to fire on Fort Sumter on the 12th of April 1861, and Edmund Ruffins is credited with firing the first shots of the war. Fort Sumter would fall on the 14th of April 1861, and Lee underwent intense questioning from General Scott, requesting he either side with the Union or resign his commission. Lee resigned his commission on the 20th of April 1861 and boarded a train to Richmond to assess the situation. He never intended nor expected a commission in the Confederacy, but upon his arrival in Richmond, he learned he was to be offered Commander-in-Chief of all Confederate forces. As many have said, Lee's decision was an inevitable one he had to make, and his fate would be tied to Virginia. Virginia officially seceded on the 23rd of May 1861, and as the decision was made, General Scott ordered Union troops across the Potomac, occupying parts of Virginia, including Lee's home in Arlington. Arlington would eventually be seized by the government for further military uses, and following the First Battle of Bull Run would serve as a cemetery for the Union dead. Under the direction of Quartermaster General Montgomery Meigs, he ordered the dead be buried to encircle the entire house at Arlington. Lee was dismayed about being prohibited from leading the first engagement at Bull Run, yet was given the chance to push the Union from Cheat's Mountain, but ultimately failed. He was then given a chance to redeem himself in the spring of 1862, as he took charge following the Battle of Seven Pines, where Joe Johnston was wounded. By the summer, General McClellan launched the Peninsular Offensive in the hope to move on Richmond, the Confederate capital. As a result, Lee ordered Ambrose P. Hill to strike at the Union flank on the 26th of June. The next week would be known as the 7 Days Battles. It was a tactical victory for the Confederates, as McClellan was forced to retreat. Lincoln was appalled at McClellan's weakness and quickly replaced him with General John Pope. In August, Lee learned that Pope would receive reinforcements from McClellan, doubling the Union's forces. Lee called for Stonewall Jackson to join the Army of Northern Virginia to attack Pope at Bull Run. Lee's main force was led by General James Longstreet, who drove Pope's right flank across the Bull Run River. Pope's failure at the Second Battle of Bull Run led him to be replaced again by McClellan. With the Union pushed out of the South, Lee invaded Maryland, sending Jackson to Harper's Ferry, while Longstreet headed further north. Lee decided to reconvene his force of 40,000 to attack McClellan, despite McClellan's force doubling Lee's. Lee broke up his army in order to attack a large garrison of Union troops in Harper's Ferry, leaving him open to attacks. McClellan intercepted a copy of Lee's battle strategy and quickly moved to attack him, pushing his forces back from South Mountain. This small battle gave Lee time to select the battlefield of his choice in the town of Sharpsburg along the Antietam River. Lee made a tactical blunder by choosing Sharpsburg, or as it's better known, Antietam. Antietam is a cul-de-sac, saddled with the Potomac on two sides, and the Antietam River on the third, leaving only one exit for Lee to retreat to Virginia. However, Hooker seemed to be incompetent to lead the army, and he made several mistakes, such as leaving Porter's corps in the reserves and nearly his entire cavalry stacked on the left near a bridge. On the 17th of September 1862, the Union attacked Lee's left from the Hagerstown Pike and his center at Antietam, with a third attack planned for the right flank. William French's division from Sumner's corps were ordered to attack the Confederate position of D. H. Hill's division stationed at the Bloody Lane. As the day went on, and the division holding the Bloody Lane was weakening, they fled from the position in a moment of confusion. Hooker did not take advantage of the situation though, and their assault ground to a halt. Hooker earlier in the day told Ambrose Burnside to attack, but he was slow to act. Burnside charged Roebuck Bridge multiple times until they finally broke Toombs' division. Lee's right wing almost collapsed until A. P. Hill's division, which was force-marched from Harper's Ferry, saved the day. As A. P. Hill pushed Burnside's corps back to Antietam Creek, Lee and Jackson questioned the chances of a successful counterattack against Hooker's right flank. Ultimately, a wide flanking maneuver was not possible, as Hooker was well positioned near the Potomac. In order for a counterattack to succeed, Jackson would have to march his corps through a corridor less than a mile wide, with Meade positioned just above the North Woods. Jackson attempted to silence Meade's guns with Stuart's light smoothbore guns, but were annihilated within 15 minutes. Ultimately, Jackson concluded that a counterattack would not be made on the Union's right flank, ordering his men and guns back to their original position. Antietam would be the single bloodiest day in American history, with a combined loss of 22,700. While Lee left the field to McClellan, the loss on the Union side outweighed the territory gained. When McClellan failed to pursue, he was fired again from his post. The Pyrrhic victory at Antietam influenced Lincoln to announce the Emancipation Proclamation on the 22nd of September, freeing all slaves in the South, and although this had little authority, it did increase the flight of slaves to the North, who would fill the ranks of the Union Army. By the middle of November, Burnside took the Army of the Potomac across the Rappahannock River towards Fredericksburg, Virginia. Tactically, Burnside blundered by not rushing to Richmond as Lee was out of position. Floods caused by rainstorms prevented Burnside from taking advantage of the situation, allowing Lee time to reposition himself. Burnside's engineers braved Confederate sniper fire from Lee's army while building a pontoon bridge to assault their position. As a result, Burnside ordered artillery strikes on the town to suppress the snipers, but ultimately failed to stop them and only gave away his true intentions. Jackson's forces were called up from his positions at Skinner's Neck and Port Royal. Brigadier General William Barksdale was tasked with delaying Burnside's advance. However, he had other plans in mind. As Burnside tried to cross, Barksdale's men heavily contested the landing, making it the first opposed river crossing in American history. His small division refused to abandon Fredericksburg and fought in the narrow alleys and homes, also making it the first time urban combat was used in the Civil War. Barksdale would eventually be forced out by the growing presence of Union forces in the city, and on the 11th of December, a few more brigades entered into the city of Fredericksburg, who sacked the city of its valuables despite the orders of the Union officers to cease. Burnside spent all of the 12th of December moving his army across the Rappahannock River to position his attack. His plan was to take Sumner Grand Division and slam into Longstreet's left flank, while Franklin would attack Jackson's corps right flank in a pincer maneuver. In the meantime, Lee had positioned himself along the ridge line and the Fredericksburg railway cut, which A.P. Hill's division occupied. Burnside's strategy was suicidal due to the limitations of the ground suitable to attack, as regiment after regiment pushed towards Mary's Height despite Lee's comfortable position behind the stone walls. The battle was a slaughter for the Union troops, as their dead numbered double the amount Lee lost. Burnside wished to continue the attack, but his generals encouraged him to withdraw. His poor performance and his use of the troops at his disposal led him to be replaced by General Joseph Hooker. In May of 1863, Lee would get the chance to test Hooker on the battlefield at Chancellorsville, Virginia. Hooker was ambitious as he split his forces into 3 columns, with his far left column advancing along the southern Rappahannock and the other 2 advancing through the wilderness towards Chancellorsville. He planned to double envelope Lee by attacking his front and rear simultaneously. Hooker also sent his entire cavalry to raid towards Richmond, which left him entirely blind to Lee's movement. Lee split his forces into 2, sending Jubal Early with 10,000 troops to Fredericksburg to deter General Sedgwick from attacking, while Lee took 50,000 troops to face Hooker. Lee's decision to split his forces caught Hooker off guard, and as a result, he recalled his 2 corps from their strategically advantageous position back to Chancellorsville. These 2 corps had already advanced on the enemy's position and were infuriated at having to withdraw through the wilderness again, losing their tactical advantage. Jackson followed cautiously and met with Lee at night to discuss the situation. Lee was vastly outnumbered against Hooker, especially since he had sent Longstreet's corps to confront attacks south of Richmond and forage for supplies. Yet despite this, the Army of Northern Virginia took an aggressive stance. Instead of taking a defensive position, Jackson undertook a risky 16-mile march around the flank of General Howard's 11th Corps. Jackson deployed 4 brigades in the evening on the 2nd of May at 5 p.m. and issued a simple order: "You may go forward." As Jackson unleashed his men to pounce on the Union flank, scores of wild animals ran from the woods as though they were fleeing a fire. Jackson rolled up the Union 11th Corps flank, catching them completely by surprise and driving them from the field. Many pockets of resistance formed, and eventually the maneuver slowed down. This daring flank attack caused Hooker to form a defensive horseshoe around Chancellorsville. Following his successful flanking, Jackson went with a few fellow officers at night to scout the new Union position. Upon running across a Union picket, they returned back to their lines, where they were mistaken for Union cavalry and fired upon. Jackson was fatally wounded and would die 8 days later of pneumonia. Lee was in distress over the news, and famously said in regard to Jackson's wound that, quote, "He has lost his left arm, but I have lost my right." Then, after Stonewall's retirement from the field, A.P. Hill, with whom Jackson had a personal feud, was himself wounded in the fighting, resulting in Jeb Stuart assuming command of the corps. However, he had never commanded infantry before, and so he resolved to wait until he could receive instructions. Lee and Stuart attacked simultaneously against Hooker, who had been knocked unconscious before the battle had begun when a cannonball struck the house Hooker was staying in. By 10 a.m. on the 3rd of May, the Union Army retreated across the Rappahannock, leaving Chancellorsville to Lee. Yet, at the same time, Lee learned that General Early had been pushed from his position in Fredericksburg by General Sedgwick upon him learning of Jackson's flanking of Hooker. This attack would go no further, as Sedgwick retreated from his position following the failed attack to rout Early, and Lee would turn his attentions to the north following his victory at Chancellorsville. Lee's plan was to take the war to the north, as much of his time campaigning had been spent in Virginia. The death of Jackson left a considerable hole in Lee's leadership, and as a result, he broke his 2 corps into 3, retaining Longstreet and promoting A.P. Hill and Richard Ewell to corps commanders. This new structure would be awkward, as Longstreet held the experience, while Ewell was indecisive and Hill almost too aggressive. Lee took his army of 75,000 into Pennsylvania, where they would eventually land at the town of Gettysburg. Hooker followed Lee, but would ultimately be replaced by George Meade, who placed himself between Lee's army and Washington, D.C. Jeb Stuart uncharacteristically left Lee's army to raid further north and harass the Army of the Potomac to try and atone for his humiliation at Brandy Station, but instead left Lee blind and guessing as to the whereabouts of the Union Army. On the 1st of July, 1863, Union Cavalry General John Buford held the ground on McPherson's Ridge when elements of Henry Heth's division appeared and started to push them off the ridge. Just as Buford was about to be forced off the ridge, Reynolds' 1st Corps showed up to support him, and Reynolds was cut down while ordering troops into the gap. The Confederates' attacks were uncoordinated at first, but ultimately broke the Union Army by early afternoon, who retreated in chaos, jamming up the streets. Lee gave his most unclear order to his newest corps commander, Ewell, as he was instructed to take Cemetery Ridge if practicable. Ewell, being indecisive, did not believe he would be able to take Cemetery Ridge with his men, and decided to rest them for the remainder of the day. The Union was now organizing on Culp's Hill, Cemetery Hill, and Cemetery Ridge, all of which would be important to win the battle. At night, Longstreet implored Lee to rethink his strategy. head south and position themselves between Meade and Washington, D.C., and wait for the Union to attack them on their own terms. Lee was determined to break the Union Army, forgetting everything he had learned while at West Point, and more specifically, his lessons he learned by reading from Napoleon. On the 2nd of July, Lee focused the attacks on the wing of the Union Army, which had formed a fishhook to allow for fast deployment of troops where they were needed. The eager and arrogant Corps Commander Daniel Sickles disobeyed orders and broke from the Union line occupying the Sherfy's Peach Orchard, forcing Meade to desperately fill in the gaps. Longstreet sent Hood's 4th Division to attack Sickles' position, while Hill threatened the center and Ewell was tasked with taking Cemetery Hill. Longstreet's attack was successful as Sickles was overrun from his position. Fierce fighting continued around Little Round Top, which was protected by the 20th Maine, because if Little Round Top fell, the whole Union Army could have been rolled from its flank. Meanwhile, on the right flank, Ewell started his attack in the evening and easily overwhelmed portions of Cemetery Ridge, yet Union reinforcements were able to push them back. On the 3rd day of the battle, Lee believed that the Union center was weak, which in theory should have been correct, but he was wrong, as Meade had reinforced his corps, guessing Lee would initiate his attack in the center. Lee had been effectively beaten already at Gettysburg, and yet made the questionable decision to attack Meade's center. In March of 1863, Lee suffered a medical episode. The exact diagnosis was unknown, but it was cardiac-related. This medical event potentially caused Lee to make the controversial decision to charge Meade's center using Pickett's division, now known as Pickett's Charge. Pickett's division would have to march over 1 mile of open ground to reach the Union line, exposed to both Union artillery and then rifles at short range. Lee started with a grand artillery barrage to soften the Union center, which failed to respond to the attacks, believing the barrage had worked, when in fact the Confederate artillery had overshot the Union line. Pickett's charge proceeded as planned. Only when the Confederates came out of the woods and were at the point of no return did the Union artillery open fire. Those Confederates who made it to the Union line were either killed or captured, completely shattering Pickett's division. Lee's defeat at Gettysburg broke the Army of Northern Virginia, and they retreated back to Virginia, having lost more than 1/3 of his army in the 3-day battle, in which half alone were killed in Pickett's charge. Lee would not engage with the Union Army again until the 4th of May, 1864, in the Battle of the Wilderness, where he faced off against General Ulysses S. Grant. Longstreet would be wounded by his own troops and be out of action for 6 months, while Lee and Grant bloodied each other in consistent counterattacks against one another. Lee personally led from the front until his men forced him to the rear by guiding his horse away from the battle. Lee would pull back to Spotsylvania and prepare for Grant's first assault on the 7th of May, leading to a nearly 2-week-long battle as Grant tried to navigate around Lee. Grant would lead a doomed assault on Cold Harbor in June. Despite having the numerical advantage against Lee, he would follow up this failure with the 9-month-long siege of Petersburg from June of 1864 to April of 1865, when he finally took the city, forcing Lee to retreat. Lee was no longer able to protect Richmond, which fell on the 3rd of April 1865. Grant pursued Lee with the help of General Sheridan and divisional leader George Custer, cutting off retreats and attacking supply wagons relentlessly. The hounding by the Union forces became too much for the beleaguered Army of Northern Virginia, and on the 9th of April 1865, Lee surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The terms were much more generous than Lee had imagined, as the sidearms of officers, private horses, and baggage were protected from seizure, and each officer and man were allowed to return home on parole, so long as they observed their parole terms. Lee spent the next few days overseeing the disarming and disbanding of the army until the 12th of April, when he left for Richmond. The Civil War would officially end on the 13th of May, 1865. After the Civil War, Lee lived a relatively quiet life, accepting a president's position at Washington College. Lee would be harassed by the Northern press throughout his time at Washington College for, quote, bringing up rebels, despite Lee trying to remove himself from the resentment many Southerners felt from losing the war, even scolding Jefferson Davis and Jubal Early for their aggressive outbursts after the war. Lee did lose his citizenship and right to vote as a result of his part in the Civil War, but these would be ultimately restored under President Johnson's second amnesty for Confederate veterans on the 25th of December, 1868. On the 28th of September, 1870, Lee was following his normal workday before attending a church meeting and then coming home for supper. Mrs. Lee poured him a cup of tea, and as he spoke to say grace, nothing came out of his mouth. Lee had had a stroke, and after 2 weeks, Robert E. Lee passed away on the 12th of October, 1870 at 10 a.m. Robert E. Lee holds a unique place in American history. He has been described as, quote, a Caesar without his ambition, a Frederick without his tyranny, a Napoleon without his selfishness, and a Washington without his reward. While Lee's view on race is abhorrent in today's light, we must judge him by the era he lived in, and the question remains, would Lee be received better today if he had stayed in the Union cavalry? Lee is often romanticized in the aftermath of his death as part of the lost cause narrative, the belief that the South fought for a righteous cause. Lee himself would have vehemently disagreed that the South cause was just, as he opposed the construction of statues of Confederate icons following the war, believing it would prevent the healing of the nation. Lee was a man filled with the potential for greatness, yet his fault at the critical moment was choosing to side with what he felt was right for himself, as many did in the Civil War. Robert E. Lee historian Elizabeth Pryor is brilliant in her analysis of Lee and asserts that, quote, we want him to be great because he has elements of greatness in him, but he falls short because greatness must rest on two pillars. For Lee to be considered great, he must, quote, create something that not only benefits the world each day, but endures and embodies a far-sightedness that reaches beyond the complacency of one's narrow experience. Lee even admits the immorality of slavery, but does not act against the institution he knows is morally wrong. And while after the war he called for unity, he resisted change that would ultimately better the world. What do you think of Robert E. Lee? Was he wrong to fight for the Confederacy, and in doing so, support states built on slavery? Or was he an honorable man who defended his home of Virginia to the last and remains, arguably, America's greatest military commander of all time? Please let us know in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
The man known to history as Stonewall Jackson was born as Thomas Jonathan Jackson on the 21st of January 1824. It is widely understood that he was born in the town of Clarksburg in the state of Virginia, although another theory suggests his mother gave birth to him while visiting family in Western Virginia. Stonewall was a nickname he would acquire very late in his life. His father was Jonathan Jackson, a Virginia attorney. He traced his ancestry in America back 3/4 of a century. The Jacksons had become a prominent family in the north of Ireland in the county of Londonderry in the 1660s, with an estate near the town of Coleraine, though they were of English descent. One scion of the family, John Jackson, Thomas's great-grandfather, was convicted of a crime in London back in the middle of the 18th century and was sent to the United States to perform penal labor at a time when the southern colonies were major sites for the sort of penal transport which Australia would become infamous for in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. It was an inauspicious beginning, but the Jacksons prospered in the United States in the decades that followed. Thomas's mother was Julia Jackson, née Neal. Thomas was her and Jonathan's third child, having previously had a daughter named Elizabeth and a son named Warren. Jackson was born during one of the most critical periods in American history, one in which the country was expanding in ways which would soon have implications for his entire life and that of many other Americans. When the United States was born in the late 1770s and early 1780s, the country consisted of just 13 states, lying in a north-south axis along the east coast, the former 13 colonies founded by the British. Even as the Founding Fathers were putting ink to the Declaration of Independence in 1776, the country was already expanding westwards beyond the Appalachian Mountains into regions where Tennessee, Kentucky, and West Virginia now lie. Settlements were also being rapidly established on the southern shores of the Great Lakes. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 would bring a vast tract of land into American possession from Louisiana north to the Dakotas. By the time Jackson was born in 1824, the Union had expanded to 24 states with the admission of Missouri in 1821. This had created two issues that would soon impact on Jackson's life. Firstly, it brought the expanding United States westwards into what is now Texas to develop a border with the similarly new state of Mexico. Secondly, it created an issue concerning the status of slavery in the states which were being newly admitted to the Union, with northern free states arguing that newly admitted states should be free states from the very beginning, and many in the southern slave-owning states holding that places like Louisiana were primarily being settled by people from Georgia, the Carolinas, and other southern states, and so should have the same slave-owning status and laws. The man who would one day become known as Stonewall had a very difficult childhood. In the mid-1820s, typhoid fever was prevalent in Virginia. It claimed Thomas's older sister, Elizabeth, in early March 1826, not long after his second birthday. Then, just over a year later, in late March 1827, Jackson's father died from the same disease. To compound the difficulties for Thomas's mother, she was heavily pregnant at the time of Jonathan Jackson's death, and she went into labor just hours after her husband's passing, giving birth shortly after to another daughter, Laura Ann. The Jacksons had been far from wealthy, and Julia Jackson was left with considerable debts when her husband died. She supported herself and her 3 young children in the years that followed by working as a seamstress and by teaching her sewing skills to other young women. Ultimately, she remarried in 1830. Thomas's new stepfather was Blake Woodson, an army captain who married Julia Jackson seemingly despite her children. His subsequent actions certainly do not indicate that he warmed to his new stepchildren, for when Julia died in 1831, just a year after marrying him, he disappeared entirely from their lives. The orphaned children had already been sent to live with their grandmother on their mother's side in Lewis County, who still presided over a household of Julia's large brood of brothers and sisters, many of whom had remained unmarried. As such, while they had lost their parents at a young age, the Jackson children were raised in a loving family household here in the 1830s. Warren Jackson was gone early to begin attending military school. Thomas thereafter developed a very close bond with his younger sister, Laura Ann. His character developed early as a shy but resourceful figure, one who developed a sense of self-reliance based on his early experiences. Thomas spent much of his childhood and teenage years at Jackson's Mill, a functioning grist or grain mill run by one of his uncles in Virginia. While Laura Ann would return periodically to their grandmother's house, Thomas developed a particular affinity for working at the mill. Although he received virtually no formal education, he taught himself to read here, with some aid from a slave on his uncle's estate. By the time he was a teenager, he was sufficiently well educated to pass on some of his skills in a makeshift local school. This was the resourceful and clearly intelligent, though formally uneducated young man that headed for West Point Military Academy in New York State in 1842 when he was 18 years of age. West Point had been founded as a national military academy in the nascent United States in 1802 and has remained the premier military school there ever since. At first, Thomas struggled here. His lack of formal schooling made his studies difficult, but through intense application, and also owing to his natural ability to retain information as soon as it was relayed to him, he managed to gradually work his way up the class from being one of the weaker students in 1842 towards the top quarter. He was one of a class of 59 cadets who graduated in 1846. He finished 17th amongst these, not a premier performance, but very respectable for an individual who had come from such a difficult background and had such a limited education before coming to West Point. When he graduated in 1846, he did so with several individuals who would become notable generals in the American Civil War, including George E. Pickett and George B. McClellan. Even as Jackson was completing his studies at West Point, tensions were escalating along the southwestern border. The regions around Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona had been claimed by Spain as part of their vast colonial empire in the Americas back in the 16th century. However, beyond some exploratory missions to the region and the establishment of missionary settlements here to try and convert the natives to Christianity, there was little effective colonization of these areas by the Spanish for centuries thereafter. Owing to this, the border regions in Texas, especially between the United States and the new state of Mexico, when it emerged independent of Spain in the early 1820s following a long war of independence, quickly became a point of contention between the Mexicans and the Americans. In 1836, an independent Republic of Texas, one which was more aligned with the US, broke away from Mexico. It would be engaged in disputes around the fixing of the border with Mexico, either at the Rio Grande or some other region, for years to come. The US then inherited that border dispute when, in February 1846, the Republic of Texas was formally annexed and entered the Union as the 28th state. War broke out between Mexico and America just 2 months later, when American troops entered Mexican territory around the Rio Grande and were attacked, leading Washington to declare war. The Mexican-American War was already underway in 1846 when Jackson graduated from West Point. He was quickly assigned to the 1st U.S. Artillery Division, which was set up to take part in General Winfield Scott's expedition to Mexico. Scott had been head of the United States Army since 1841, and would hold that position until early in the American Civil War 20 years later. His objective in 1846 was Mexico City, the aim being to capture the Mexican capital and quickly force significant land concessions out of the Mexicans. It would take until the autumn of 1847 before Scott's invasion force, Jackson included, made it to Mexico City. They commenced a siege on the 8th of September. 5 days later, Jackson distinguished himself in the capture of Chapultepec, a castle fortress on the edge of the city. The city itself capitulated 2 days later. Thereafter, the Mexicans entered into peace negotiations with the U.S. and, through the Treaty of Guadalupe, Hidalgo, signed on the 2nd of February 1848, it ceded a vast stretch of its northern territories to the U.S., comprising the subsequent states of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, California, and parts of Oregon and Colorado. With this, the Americans in Mexico City and other regions of central Mexico, Jackson amongst them, began withdrawing back northwards to the U.S. 24-year-old Jackson was soon redeployed after serving his apprenticeship in Mexico. Back in the mid-19th century, Florida was still the one part of the eastern United States that was a relatively new part of the country, having only gradually been absorbed into the country after being a Spanish possession in the 1800s and 1810s. Even once it became part of the US, the government entered into a series of conflicts known as the Seminole Wars against the indigenous people there, who were able to resist American government for decades by launching guerrilla wars out of the swamps of the Florida Panhandle and the Everglades, often aided by escaped slaves from Georgia. Jackson was sent here in 1849 and was appointed to the second most senior position at Fort Meade, not far from Tampa. There, he soon developed a fractious relationship with the head of the garrison at Fort Meade, Major William French. Both men reported back to Washington on the alleged failures of the other on several occasions. Jackson was well aware that French, a figure nearly 10 years his senior and who had earned commendations for his service in Mexico, would ultimately win out in this disagreement, and in 1851 he decided to resign when it became clear that the War Department was not going to support him in his accusations against French. Jackson's retirement from the army in 1851 did not lead to his complete abandonment of military life. Instead, he acquired a position straight away as Professor of Natural and Experimental Philosophy at the Military Institute in Lexington in Virginia. This is akin to a modern professor of physics, and Jackson was also specializing in artillery at Lexington. He knew the position was in the offing when he made his decision to retire from his post in Florida. He must have questioned the wisdom of his career change early on in Lexington, as he did not have any natural ability as a teacher and did not acclimatize well to it initially. Before long, some of the cadets had begun referring to him behind his back as Tom Fool. There was more than a touch of elitism inherent in this. Jackson was a rural Virginia man from a poor background, and his accent and pronunciation revealed this, particularly when he spoke in his high-pitched tone during military parades. He was often teaching young cadets who came from upper-class landed Virginia families who viewed him as their social inferior. Others, though, would later reflect that he was kind and attentive to the more dedicated students, and over time his lack of natural abilities as a teacher were compensated for by his hard work and dedication. It was also at this time that Jackson became a husband twice and then a father. On the 4th of August 1853, he married Eleanor Junkin. She was the daughter of the Reverend George Junkin, the head of Washington College, a school in Lexington. This first union of Jackson's was brief, though, as Eleanor died just over a year later in October 1854. She had been pregnant and died from complications after having a stillbirth. 3 years later, in the summer of 1857, he then married Mary Anna Morrison, who went by Anna. Continuing his habit of marrying the daughters of preachers and the heads of schools, her father was Reverend Robert Morrison, president of Davidson College in the town of Charlotte in the state of North Carolina. They would have 2 children. Mary Graham was born in 1858, though sadly died in infancy. A second daughter, Julia Laura, arrived in November 1862. She would live into her adult years, being claimed by typhoid fever, the same illness that killed Thomas's sister and father when he was a child, in 1889, when she was in her mid-20s. Thomas's home life with Anna, brief as it might have proved to be, was one of the few areas of his life where he felt free to relax, and she would later describe her husband in affectionate terms, something which contrasted substantially with his reputation for being a strict and stern figure in public and as a commander. A further element of Thomas's character was his religious piety. After a youth in which he had been a casual worshipper, he had begun to embrace a more zealous Christianity in his adult years, particularly after he arrived in Lexington to begin teaching at the Military Institute. It was more than just a coincidence that he ended up marrying the daughters of 2 different ministers. Such were his growing associations with the Lexington Presbyterian Church in the town. In time, much of his life began to revolve around his faith, teaching at Sunday schools after church services. His religious views were matched in intensity by his hypochondria. He suffered from a number of physical ailments throughout his adult life, apparently having issues with both his digestion and his vision. It's not possible to determine where these legitimate conditions ended and his paranoia began, though many people during his lifetime commented on Jackson's peculiar habits and his belief that reading by lamplight would destroy his vision, or that he should refrain from eating certain foods or at certain times. These features of his personality and his guarded approach towards people that he did not know particularly well led many to perceive Jackson as being a somewhat peculiar character. Conversely, the impression left by those who got to know him and whom he relaxed around was of a largely ordinary man with the same level of quirks and unusual mannerisms that are revealed in anyone once one knows them for long enough. Jackson wasn't the only one who was anxious in the 1850s. The United States was becoming increasingly disunited by the middle of the 19th century. There had always been two Americas. As early as the 1780s, when the American Revolutionary War was coming to an end, some of the northern states were already considering prohibiting the institution of slavery. Their economies had never been reliant on slave labor, being largely trading and manufacturing centers where greater degrees of urbanization prevailed, whereas the South was rural and dominated by cotton and tobacco plantations on which large numbers of slaves carried out most of the labor. Many northern states began to ban slavery in the late 18th and early 19th centuries and became free states, while the southern states became more entrenched in their determination to maintain slavery. The issue became more and more fraught from the 1830s onwards, once Britain banned slavery entirely across its empire and other European and American nations began following their lead. By the 1850s, the US was a laggard in not having banned slavery nationally, and northern politicians were determined to correct this with new parties, such as the Free Soil Party, being established primarily with the goal of abolition in mind, though eventually it was the Republican Party, founded in 1854, which would drive the abolition movement prior to the American Civil War. These developments would shape the rest of Jackson's relatively short life. Of course, the question arises, what were Jackson's own views on slavery? They were complicated. On the one hand, he was a slave owner himself. At one point in the 1850s, he owned 6 slaves. Some of these he had acquired as part of the dowry for his second marriage. Others had requested that he purchase them at public auction, believing that Jackson would make a more decent owner than they might otherwise expect if they were sold to a cotton or tobacco plantation. Being a teacher and not much of a landowner, he often rented out their labor to others in Lexington and to the Military Institute. Furthermore, while he was not a staunch voice against the abolition movement, there is also no record of any kind of him voicing opposition to the institution of slavery. That said, while teaching in Lexington, he included African American children in the Sunday school classes that he taught at the Presbyterian Church, staring down a lot of opposition in doing so from members of the congregation who were opposed to such a move. In short, he epitomized the more moderate Southern Confederate. Jackson was involved in one of the most important episodes in the abolition agitation which characterized the 1850s and which was one of the major precursors to the outbreak of the American Civil War. On the 16th of October, 1859, the firebrand abolitionist campaigner John Brown had taken over the U.S. military arsenal at Harper's Ferry in Virginia, along with nearly 24 followers. His plan was to incite a slave revolt across the southern states through his example. Instead, his small band was quickly surrounded and Harper's Ferry was laid siege to. It ended 2 days later with half of Brown's men killed and the rest arrested. Brown was quickly sentenced to be executed. Jackson received word at the Military Institute that he and some of his senior students were to be sent as artillery officers to attend the execution at Charlestown, in what is now West Virginia, on the 2nd of December, 1859. Stonewall Jackson would acquire his famous name and forge his legacy in the American Civil War. Strangely, for such a pivotal conflict in American history, and one which seems to have ostensibly been fought over one issue, historians still debate why the war broke out. Clearly, the issue of slavery and the determination of the northern states to abolish the practice nationwide was the defining cause of the war, but there were some other issues as well, with many who would take up the Confederate cause arguing then and afterwards that it was also about a different, urbanized, industrializing society in the northern states trying to impose its way of life on the American South and failing to respect its traditions. There may be at least some kernel of truth to this, for Jackson was not ideologically wedded to the preservation of slavery, yet nevertheless became a committed Confederate for a range of other reasons. Tensions nationally reached a crisis during the U.S. presidential election of 1860, when the concerns of the southern states were whipped up over the potential election of the new Republican Party's candidate, Abraham Lincoln. What's often overlooked is that while Lincoln was clearly anti-slavery, he did not run on an abolitionist platform in 1860. However, enough people believed he intended to abolish slavery all the same that, when he won the election following the vote on the 6th of November in what was a deeply divided field of candidates, talk intensified in the southern states about seceding from the federal union to avoid having abolition imposed by Lincoln's administration when he took office. South Carolina seceded on the 20th of December 1860, followed by numerous other states westwards to Louisiana and Texas in the first months of 1861. These formed themselves into the Confederate States of America in early February, the capital of which was soon fixed in Richmond, Virginia, bizarrely located less than 100 miles from Washington, D.C. When the Confederates attacked federal troops fighting for what became known as the Union government in the conflict that was now developing, at Fort Sumter in South Carolina on the 12th of April 1861, it signaled the commencement of the American Civil War. The war would pitch a confederacy consisting of Virginia, Georgia, the Carolinas, Florida, Alabama, Tennessee, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, and Arkansas against the northern states from New England, New York, and Pennsylvania all the way westwards to the Great Lakes. The newly emergent states of California, Oregon, and Nevada also joined the Union cause. Several states, such as West Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, and Kentucky, effectively became border states that were on the front line of the conflict between North and South, and which were pulled to and fro by both camps over the next several years. It may seem curious for a man who would become a legendary figure within the Confederate cause, but Jackson was not in favor of secession in the period leading up to the outbreak of the Civil War. He, like many others, wanted to preserve the Union. It was only later, when he perceived the choice as being between the maintenance of Southern society and the preservation of the Union, that he became an advocate of secession, his conversion coming about late in 1860 and early 1861, even as states were beginning to secede. As such, he was one of many people who were cast into a tunnel vision by the 1860 election that doomed them to thinking that only war could resolve the nation's difficulties. His decision to eventually support the Confederate cause was a difficult one for Thomas on a personal level. His sister Laura, with whom he had a close bond since childhood, supported the Union and was particularly ardent in this, her backing for Lincoln's administration in Washington being more fervent than Thomas's for the Richmond government. Even before the war broke out, this had caused a split between the pair that would never be healed. Years later, when she learned of his death, she feigned a lack of concern, but privately seemed to be disturbed by the news. It was all a sign of how divisive the American Civil War was in pitting family members against each other, and how complicated the emotions that ensued could be. Despite becoming the center of the Confederate government in the American Civil War, Virginia was actually quite late to secede. The Virginia Convention initially voted to remain a part of the Union when they voted on the issue in early 1861. It was not until a meeting on the 17th of April 1861, 5 days after the attack on Fort Sumter, that Virginia voted to secede and left the Union. This began Jackson's Civil War, as he was a Virginia native and employed there. As the state government swiftly mobilized onto a war footing, he was appointed as a major of the topographical engineers within the Confederate Army here, a role which would involve overseeing establishing defensive fortifications and also working with the officer corps of the Confederate Army on issues like mapping out the war zones across Virginia and the distribution of forces in the region. Frustrated at the sedentary nature of this, he petitioned for an active command and was soon made a colonel of the infantry at Harper's Ferry, the arsenal where John Brown had attempted to launch his revolt 2 years earlier. A further promotion to become a brigadier general in the Confederate Army soon followed. Jackson's first major engagement, and the one in which he would earn his famous nickname, was the First Battle of Bull Run, fought on the 21st of July, 1861, and so named after a stream that runs through the region where the battle took place. The clash is also known as the Battle of Manassas. It occurred near the city of Manassas in northeastern Virginia, not far at all from Washington, D.C., emphasizing the threat the Confederates posed to Lincoln's government in the first half of the war. Though they had larger forces in the wider region at the time, both the Union and Confederate commanders were only able to commit slightly less than 20,000 men each to the battle when it commenced. In the engagement, Jackson's brigade of men stood strong for hours under heavy fire from Union forces, with Thomas nearly being killed as a bullet grazed his hand and broke his middle finger. The battle ended in a Confederate victory of a kind, though both sides suffered significant losses, and it made clear that there would be no swift victory for either side in the war. Jackson earned his nickname Stonewall from the engagement, with one of the Confederate commanders, General Barnard B., stating at one point during the fighting, "Look, men, there is Jackson standing like a stone wall," in an attempt to buck his men up by looking to Jackson for inspiration. It was a name that would be attached to him for the rest of his life, and the forces under his command would become known as Stonewall's Brigade. That said, to his men, he was often known as Old Jack, a nickname he had acquired years earlier when studying at West Point in the mid-1840s on account of his being the oldest cadet in his class. Jackson was now promoted to the post of Major General in the Provisional Army of the Confederate States. He would soon earn further renown owing to his leading role in the Shenandoah Campaign, often also termed the Jackson's Valley Campaign. The Shenandoah Valley is a valley in the northwest of the state of Virginia. It had a strategic significance within the war, as it allowed for passage between Virginia north to states like Maryland, Delaware, and Pennsylvania, in a part of the country where natural routeways for armies to pass through are limited, owing to the Blue Ridge Mountains and several rivers. Equally, if any large Union army wanted to pass southwards to strike at places like Western Virginia, North Carolina, or Tennessee, the Shenandoah Valley was an obvious passageway. An indication of this is that when Robert E. Lee invaded the northern states in 1863 in the lead-up to the Battle of Gettysburg, he led his men northwards to Pennsylvania through the Shenandoah Valley. In the spring of 1862, Jackson was sent to secure this region and prevent any Union incursions southwards. This was coming at a time when Confederate fortunes in the early stages of the war were at a low ebb after a series of defeats in the second half of 1861, especially further west, where the Union General and future President Ulysses S. Grant had won several important victories in the autumn and winter of 1861. The immediate concern for Jackson when he led some 15,000 men westwards into the Shenandoah Valley in the early spring of 1862 was to block the advance of Union forces through the valley who might manage to then reinforce the Union Army of General George B. McClellan, Jackson's old classmate from West Point. If he was reinforced, it was possible that McClellan would be able to threaten Richmond and potentially capture the Confederate capital. Over the course of a 4-month campaign between March and June 1862, Stonewall managed to win a chain of successive victories over the Union forces in the Shenandoah Valley. The first victory of a kind came at the Battle of Kernstown on the 23rd of March. It was somewhat ambiguous. Theoretically, Jackson lost more men than Nathan Kimball's Union forces, but he pressured the Union to divert forces which were heading to reinforce McClellan away from their destination and into the Shenandoah Valley to deal with the threat which Stonewall's brigade now posed there. Thereafter, he continued to harry the Union forces in the valley, culminating in 2 victories on 2 successive days at Cross Keys and Port Republic on the 8th and 9th of June 1862. None of these involved catastrophic defeats for the Union forces in the Shenandoah Valley. Instead, it was a series of attritional victories for Jackson, ones in which he inflicted a few hundred more casualties on his opponents on several occasions, and which collectively made it nigh on impossible for the Union to use the Shenandoah Valley to reinforce McClellan. Owing to this, the effort to try and strike at Richmond had to be constantly postponed in 1862, while in the Union capital, Lincoln's government was wary of the possibility that, if he was reinforced himself, Jackson could make a swift surprise attack on Washington, D.C. Union forces and had to be kept on a defensive posture in the capital as a result, tying up divisions which otherwise could have been employed against the Confederates elsewhere to the south. The Shenandoah Valley campaign earned Jackson a lot of respect from his contemporaries, both amongst Confederate and Union military commanders. It occurred during a period when Confederate fortunes were not good and a strategic victory of some kind was much needed. He had achieved his successes through traits which came to characterize his entire leadership style. For Jackson, speed was critical. If he was able to prevent the Union from utilizing the Shenandoah Valley, then he needed to be able to move quickly around and respond to developments when and as they occurred. This was no mean task, commanding what was primarily an infantry army. In order to achieve it, he would demand punishing marches of his men where they moved so swiftly that they began referring to themselves as Jackson's foot cavalry, the suggestion being they could move as fast as cavalry divisions. This ensured that even though he was always substantially outnumbered in the Shenandoah Valley, having about 17,000 men at maximum strength against combined Union detachments of 30,000 or more, he was able to win numerous tactical victories, often striking at isolated sections of the Union Army and never engaging their full forces. It has been estimated that Jackson and his men marched over 600 miles in different directions around Western Virginia in the space of 7 weeks between late April and early June 1862, averaging about 12 miles per day. No easy feat for men carrying military equipment in a warm Virginia May and June. Unsurprisingly, many of Jackson's rank-and-file soldiers initially disliked his methods, though as they achieved a growing number of victories, they could see the wisdom in their rather unorthodox commander's approach. As much as Jackson's reputation was burnished by the Shenandoah Valley campaign, it was not without controversy. One of his junior officers was Brigadier General Richard B. Garnett. Garnett was in charge of one of the divisions of Stonewall's brigade at the Battle of Kernstown early in the campaign, during the course of which he ordered a retreat of his units without receiving authorization from Jackson. After the battle, Jackson accused Garnett of cowardice and began the process of having him court-martialed. In the midst of war, the Confederate Staff Command was not particularly interested in trying to resolve a dispute between two officers in a situation where the facts of what had occurred were open to debate. Nevertheless, Jackson continued to press the case, and Garnett remained under investigation into 1863. He was still living under a cloud when the Battle of Gettysburg occurred in that year. Garnett died in the course of this, with many interpreting a reckless charge which he led during the engagement as an attempt to recover his reputation and honor in light of Jackson's charges. It was a symptom of one of the less pleasant aspects of Jackson's character and role as a commander. He could be extremely demanding and obstinate in his demands, often requiring more of his men than many deemed to be practically possible. This, along with his generally guarded character, could rub people the wrong way, and he often clashed with other military officers. On top of this, some of those who worked with him, particularly junior officers like Garnett, found his methods peculiar at times. Jackson had a habit of not revealing what his overall strategy was in campaigns like the one in the Shenandoah Valley, only drip-feeding information to his sub-officers at the last minute. Many of these officers felt this was excessive and prevented them from carrying out their orders or responding to events on the field of battle without knowing what the overall operational strategy was. As the Shenandoah Valley campaign came to an end in the summer of 1862, Robert E. Lee called Jackson back eastwards towards Richmond. He had been mired in a clash known as the Peninsula Campaign here for several months, so named after the Virginia Peninsula, a strip of land where Jamestown, the first permanent European settlement in the United States, had been founded 2.5 centuries earlier, and which Richmond stood at the very upper end of. By late May, McClellan was determined to lay siege to Richmond even without the major reinforcement he had been looking for through the Shenandoah Valley. Owing to Jackson having limited this reinforcement through his maneuvers to the west, Lee managed to repel McClellan's advance on the Confederate capital. Then, in late June, having been reinforced himself by Jackson, he went on the offensive in a series of engagements known as the 7 Days Battles between the 25th of June and the 1st of July, 1862. In these, Jackson and Stonewall's brigade participated in several engagements at Mechanicsville, Savage's Station, and Malvern Hill, amongst others. It was not his greatest performance, with some contemporaries and military historians since noting that his men moved slowly and that Jackson was tardy in implementing some commands. There were some good reasons for this, however. By midsummer 1862, his men were exhausted from months of heavy forced marches in the Shenandoah, and then a swift trek back eastwards to participate in different battles day after day. Jackson was also less familiar with the terrain here than he was back westwards where he had spent much of his life, and the maps he was provided with did little to help him in this regard. Observers noted he looked tired, and Jackson was certainly running on fumes by the time of the 7 Days battles. Despite his own personal limitations, Lee was successful in expelling McClellan's forces and bringing the Peninsula Campaign to an end. Much of this was owing to Jackson's efforts in the Shenandoah Valley over the previous months. Victory in the 7 Days battles provided the Confederates with only a brief respite from another Union push into Virginia, although it was sufficient for Jackson and his men to get a week's rest, a few nights of proper sleep, and to put back on a few pounds after weeks of forced marches. Newly reinvigorated by late July, Lee offered Jackson a new command to head north and repulse an incursion by a Union force under the command of General John Pope. Pope was aiming to capture Gordonsville, 60 miles northwest of Richmond. He didn't immediately end up engaging with Pope and his larger army. Instead, Jackson received word that a Union force of some 12,000 men under Nathaniel P. Banks was in a position at Cedar Mountain, south of the town of Culpeper, about 30 miles north of Gordonsville. He moved to intercept them and cut them off from Pope's larger force with about 22,000 men. Heavily outnumbering Banks's army, Jackson was able to win a substantial victory at the Battle of Cedar Mountain on the 9th of August 1862, again employing his trademark swift movement across the Virginia countryside to good effect. Within weeks, Jackson was involved in another major engagement. This was the Second Battle of Bull Run, fought in the final days of August 1862. His role in the second major clash near Manassas, in the space of just over a year, emphasizes the sheer endless nature of Jackson's wartime effort. He went to war in April 1861 and was almost constantly campaigning over the next 2 years. In one of the largest battles yet of the Civil War, he was deputized next to Lee. Jackson's troops were responsible for maneuvering around the Union army of General John Pope and capturing their supply depot at Manassas Junction. This occurred on the 27th of August. Pope then moved with his larger forces to strike at Jackson's divisions on the 28th. Jackson and his men lived up to their Stonewall reputation by standing firm against Pope's attacks for long enough that Lee then moved into the Manassas area and struck Pope's left flanks on the 30th of August, inflicting serious casualties on the Union Army and driving them out of the Manassas region. This was a major victory for the Confederates, one which now allowed them to consider launching a counter-campaign into Maryland after a solid year of fending off attacks from the Union armies in Virginia. Jackson was central to its success. Immediately after the Second Battle of Bull Run, Lee divided his forces. He headed north with the bulk of the Virginia army to strike into Maryland and threaten Washington, D.C., leaving Jackson with a reserve force in Virginia to try to consolidate Confederate control over regions that the Union armies had previously captured and to prevent any surprise strike towards Richmond. On the 15th of September, with the Union now preparing to defend Maryland, Jackson was able to take advantage of the situation to capture Harper's Ferry, taking a significant number of POWs in the garrison in the process. Having done so, he then immediately began a swift march towards Lee's position in Maryland. The Confederate commander had been blocked here by McClellan's forces at Antietam Creek near the town of Sharpsburg as the Union general sought to prevent McClellan advancing any further north. Jackson's swift march there couldn't prevent a Union victory in the Battle of Antietam on the 17th of September, but his arrival did ensure that Lee did not suffer a major defeat as Jackson's men provided cover during a staged withdrawal. Not long afterwards, in recognition of exceptional service over the past year and a half, Lee promoted Jackson to the rank of lieutenant general and assigned him as overall commander of the Second Corps, effectively now being junior only to Lee himself on the Virginia front in the war. Jackson would fight in one final major engagement in 1862. This was at the Battle of Fredericksburg in mid-December. Fredericksburg lies almost exactly midway between Washington, D.C. and Richmond, and the battle here was possibly a fitting statement of how evenly matched the two sides in the Civil War were as 1862 drew to a close. It came about owing to one of the, by now, common efforts to launch a surprise attack at an enemy capital, in this case by a Union army led by Major General Ambrose Burnside. Jackson was appointed to command the right flank of the forces which were commanded overall by Lee. A curious element of the engagement was that Jackson left a gap in his lines which Burnside's forces attempted to exploit. Whether or not this was an intentional effort to lure the Union troops into some sort of trap, or simply a mistake by Jackson, remains unclear. The battle eventually ended on the 15th of December in a Confederate victory. With the Union repulsed, both sides withdrew to winter camps, and there was a lack of activity into the early spring of 1863. This period of unusual rest for Jackson was complicated by several of his junior officers requesting transfers to other divisions where they would not be under Jackson's command. Resentments were brewing amongst officers about his unwillingness to consult with them about tactical plans, with Jackson treating his underlings like automatons who should simply obey his orders unquestioningly. One of the dissenters was even his brother-in-law, D.H. Hill, who was married to Isabella Morrison, the sister of Jackson's wife, Anna. By the late spring of 1863, the Confederate lines in Virginia were increasingly stretched and short of men to plug the gaps. The Union commander, Joseph Hooker, decided to take advantage of this by outflanking Lee's position and trying to push south towards Richmond. As with so much else about the war in Virginia and the border states, the strategic imperative was to threaten the enemy's capital so as to force them to divert armies from elsewhere. This resulted in late April in the Battle of Chancellorsville, fought over the space of a week down to the 6th of May. Jackson and Stonewall's brigade played an absolutely crucial role in this. The early stages of the battle were fought between Lee's armies and those of Hooker, but on the 2nd of May, Jackson executed a brilliant counter-flanking maneuver in which his signature swift march surprised Hooker's troops with an attack on the right of their positions around Chancellorsville. In order to achieve this, they had to pass through a 7-mile stretch of Virginia known as the Wilderness. Such was its inhospitable nature. Hooker simply did not expect that Jackson could pass through it, and his men were so unprepared when Stonewall's brigade arrived out of nowhere that their flank buckled. This turned the tide in the wider Battle of Chancellorsville, allowing Lee to emerge with a major victory overall a few days later, the Union forces having suffered over 4,000 more casualties than the Confederates. Jackson's victory came at a terrible personal price. When his men emerged from the Wilderness to strike at Hooker's flank on the 2nd of May, they did so out of order and were not lined up properly. As night descended that evening, matters became quite confused, and Jackson was hit in multiple places in his right hand and his left arm by friendly fire. The wound to the upper humerus of his left arm was deep, and in an age before antibiotics to prevent such injuries becoming gangrenous, the only solution was amputation. Had Jackson's injury occurred just a few decades earlier, there would have been very little pain relief on offer during this procedure, other than what might be achieved through opium and alcohol. Somewhat luckily for the 60,000 men who had legs or arms amputated during the American Civil War, chloroform had been developed as a form of anesthesia in the 1830s and 1840s, and its use as a field anesthesia had been popularized during the Crimean War. Jackson was carried in the dark from the battlefield to a field hospital, a very long journey of several miles in which he was dropped twice from his stretcher. When he arrived there, chloroform was administered, and then the procedure was carried out on his left arm in an operation lasting 50 minutes. It was a sign of how effective chloroform was for this that within a few hours he was lucid and talking with people in the field hospital despite his injuries. Amputation was not simply about surviving the surgery during the Civil War. The shock of the operation and the risks of gangrene setting in anyway were such that many men died in the week or two afterwards. Jackson was one of the unlucky ones. In the days that followed, he developed pneumonia as his body reacted to his injuries, despite his doctors initially being confident of a full recovery. Learning of the news in the aftermath of the victory at Chancellorsville, Lee directed a messenger to head to the field hospital and tell Jackson that he has lost his left arm, but I my right, in reference to his reliance on Jackson as a field commander in Virginia. It's debatable if Jackson ever received the message, or, if he did, if he was lucid enough to understand it. After several days of his condition worsening, he died on the 10th of May, 1863, 8 days after being shot. He was just 39 years of age. His funeral was performed and he was buried at Lexington, where he had taught and lived for many years, on the 15th of May. Jackson died just as the American Civil War was about to turn conclusively in favor of the Union. Just 8 weeks later, the Battle of Gettysburg was fought over the course of the first 3 days of July in 1863 around Gettysburg in the state of Pennsylvania. The clash was fought as part of Lee's efforts to take the war against the Union into the northern states. It proved a costly mistake. Although both sides suffered major losses and there were well over 40,000 casualties in all, the Union managed to repulse the Confederate invasion of the northern states. Thereafter, the superior economic and demographic power of the Union became decisive. While it managed to keep recruiting soldiers and providing them with arms and munitions, the Confederate supply lines collapsed over time, and they began to lose more and more battles in a long stretch of territory from the Atlantic Ocean westwards to New Mexico and Arizona. Eventually, in May 1865, the war came to an end after the surrender of some of the last Confederate armies and strongholds. Through the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, slavery was prohibited across the Union, although the program of Reconstruction of the South would fail in the 1870s, and segregation and the Jim Crow laws quickly began to create a new form of major discrimination across the South through other means. In the post-war period, Jackson's legacy was lionized by defenders of the Confederacy and its cause, and he soon became a Southern folk hero of sorts, second only to Lee in the canon of Confederate war heroes. Many even speculated that if Jackson had survived and been at Gettysburg, the most significant battle of the entire war might have ended differently. His reputation was further burnished by his widow, who published 2 memoirs addressing elements of her life with her husband, books which included the text of many of his letters. In October 1919, a large equestrian statue of Jackson on a high pedestal was unveiled on Monument Avenue in Richmond, the former capital of the Confederacy, where it joined statues of other Confederate generals and leaders like Lee and Jefferson Davis. Over time, he developed a dual legacy, one in which he was both a Confederate hero and also a figure who appealed to others who were less enamored of the Southern cause, viewing him as a romantic moderate, someone who was not a hard-line supporter of slavery, but with his Christian piety was genuinely a champion of the more rustic, conservative, tradition-bound life of the South. Hence, many American generals and commanders of the 20th century, such as George Patton and Douglas MacArthur, expressed admiration for Stonewall, while numerous writers like Alan Tate and Ernest Hemingway referred to him in their work. Like all Confederate political figures and commanders, Jackson's statue and monument in Richmond became a source of major controversy in the early 21st century, and the statue was removed in the summer of 2020 after being vandalized weeks earlier during Black Lives Matter protests. Another statue of Jackson at the Virginia Military Institute, where he taught throughout the 1850s, was moved to Newmarket Battlefield State Historical Park, where it was felt the statue could be displayed in a balanced way as a historical memento of the history of the Civil War without lionizing the Confederate cause. Thomas Stonewall Jackson was one of the more complicated Confederate generals and leaders. He was a pious Christian and a reserved man who at the same time was a slave owner and never expressed any disdain for the institution of slavery. Yet, at the same time, he was someone who taught black children and educated them at Sunday school throughout much of the 1850s. In this sense, he points towards the complexity of Southern society in the antebellum era. His reputation and career as a general are equally complex. While there is no doubt he was successful in many of his campaigns, notably his contribution to the First Battle of Bull Run, from which he acquired his nickname Stonewall, and most especially in the Shenandoah campaign, there were also engagements and actions which he performed quite poorly in. He could also be a difficult commanding officer and clashed with many individuals throughout his time in the military. There is no doubt that he was a substantial general and a figure whose skills as a commander could win the day in a close military contest. What do you think of Stonewall Jackson? Was he a great general, or were his abilities overstated by individuals in the late 19th century seeking to lionize some of the leading Confederate commanders? Please, let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.